27 royals, dead before their time, killed not by war, not by poison, but by something far stranger, fevers that made kings forget their names, rashes that erased empires, plagues that travelled faster than armies. Some died screaming, others simply faded. The official records whisper one thing, the bodies say another, and in every case the question lingers, what really killed them? This isn't just history, it's pathology with a crown. Welcome to 27 royals who died of strange diseases, where power meant nothing and the mystery only deepens. Before we dive into the first case, make sure you're subscribed. These stories only get stranger. Hit the bell so you don't miss what history tried to bury. And while you're here, tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Let's see who else is up late with the dead. 1. Alexander the Great, King of Macedon, died 323 BCE. They said he couldn't die, not because he was divine, though he liked that rumour, not because he was young, though he was, and certainly not because he lacked enemies, because by then there were plenty. No, they said he couldn't die because he had already done the impossible, unified Greece, crushed Persia, pushed through deserts, mountains and rebellion with a kind of destiny-drunk swagger that rewrote entire borders. And when the man they called the son of Zeus fell ill, it wasn't supposed to end like this. But it did, slowly, strangely. By the time Alexander the Great died in Babylon in June of 323 BCE, at the age of 32, the empire stretched from the Ionian Sea to the Indus River, and the man who had commanded the loyalty of armies and the fear of kings lay still, wrapped in silence, not on a battlefield, not in a blaze of conquest, but in a slow, sweating descent into paralysis, fever, and, in what ancient sources describe with a whiff of unease, something that looked eerily like being alive while unable to move. The fever came first, after a night of drinking, or maybe 2 nights, depending on which ancient historian you believe. Alexander either drank himself into oblivion or simply complained of pain after a banquet. It was a regular Macedonian evening. Booze, war stories, impossible egos. The next morning he woke up unwell. The fever got worse. Within days he couldn't speak. He couldn't move. His commanders stood by, silent and uneasy, as his body refused to die quickly. It took 12 days. Some said he had been poisoned, though this makes for a better conspiracy theory than science. For poison to work that slowly, without other symptoms, would have required a fantasy chemical that even modern assassins might envy. And besides, what could you possibly give to a man who had already consumed enough alcohol to sedate a city-state? Modern scholars have turned the mystery into a diagnostic contest. The contenders are appropriately strange: typhoid fever, West Nile virus, malaria, acute pancreatitis, and, perhaps most intriguingly, Guillain-Barré syndrome, a rare autoimmune disorder that paralyzes the body from the feet up. Some versions allow for full consciousness while rendering the victim totally immobile, which would explain the most chilling part. According to ancient reports, Alexander's body didn't decompose for 6 days after death. In the ancient world, that wasn't seen as suspicious. It was seen as holy, a mark of divinity. The gods had preserved him, but if you ask a neurologist instead of a priest, that detail invites a darker theory. What if he wasn't dead at all? Guillain-Barré, in its rarest forms, can paralyze the muscles involved in breathing, facial movement, even blinking, while leaving the mind entirely intact. It's been called locked-in syndrome in other contexts. Some scholars now wonder whether Alexander's body was embalmed, honored and prepared for burial while he was still alive, aware and unable to scream. That's not history, it's horror. But even if you leave aside the more macabre theories, the mystery refuses to settle. Babylon was filled with physicians, Greek and local alike. His personal doctor, Philip of Acarnania, was by his side. The royal court was full of schemers, flatterers, generals, and relatives with conflicting ambitions. And yet no one, not one chronicler, was able to say with certainty what had killed the most powerful man on earth. The fever came, the strength drained, and the fire that had launched 1,000 funerals guttered out in confusion. The funeral, fittingly, turned into a spectacle. His body was placed in a golden sarcophagus set inside an elaborate funeral cart and meant to return to Macedon. It never made it. Ptolemy, one of his former generals, hijacked the corpse and rerouted it to Egypt, where it was placed in a tomb in Alexandria. A power move, obviously. Possession of Alexander's body meant legitimacy, but the tomb itself, lost. To this day, a fitting epilogue for a man whose death refuses to give up its secrets. The most powerful figure of his age died like a commoner, feverish, voiceless, and still. The cause of death remains speculation. The body is missing. The empire splintered almost immediately, and maybe that's the irony, that a man who rewrote geography left behind nothing but medical guesswork and a ghost map of where he might be buried. But Alexander wasn't the only royal whose death invited more questions than answers. Because across the sands of time, in another ancient desert, another king was dying, quietly pockmarked by a disease that hadn't even been named yet. 2. Ramesses V, Pharaoh of Egypt, DC 1157 BCE. He ruled Egypt, briefly, likely for just 4 years, maybe less. And then he vanished into legend, into dust, into a medical case study that has fascinated virologists, pathologists, and armchair historians for over a century. The story of Ramesses V, 20th dynasty pharaoh of Egypt, doesn't come with thunder or war. It comes with a whisper and a rash. In the grand sweep of pharaonic history, Ramesses V is more footnote than headline. He wasn't a Ramses the Great, not a temple builder or a military hero. His reign occurred during a period of slow decline, marked by economic instability, foreign incursions, and bureaucratic chaos. But what sets him apart is not what he built or conquered. It's how he may have died, and more specifically, what his skin tells us. Ramesses V's body wasn't just mummified, it was remarkably preserved, at least compared to most of his peers. When his tomb, Cave I-9, was opened in the 19th century, archaeologists were stunned to find a face still visible, chest and arms still intact, and most oddly, distinctive lesions across his face and torso. Small circular marks, raised, uniform, like the fingerprints of a disease that left its signature across time. And here's where the story starts to get weird. Because to modern eyes, especially the eyes of epidemiologists, those marks look suspiciously like smallpox. Smallpox, one of humanity's most devastating diseases. A virus so persistent and so fatal that its eradication in the 20th century was hailed as a triumph of civilization. But if Ramesses V did die of smallpox, that changes the textbook narrative dramatically. It pushes the confirmed existence of the disease back by over 2,000 years, and it means that ancient Egypt, a land of sun gods and scarabs, was already haunted by a microbe that would later circle the globe. Still, the evidence is murky. Let's be fair, the diagnosis isn't universally accepted. The claim that Ramesses V is the earliest documented smallpox victim is based on visual inspection, not lab-confirmed virology. After all, ancient DNA degrades, viruses don't fossilize, and radiological or molecular testing on his mummy has been minimal. Skeptics have pointed out that other skin diseases like chickenpox or even certain fungal infections can mimic smallpox in appearance. But supporters of the theory point out that variola major, the deadliest form of smallpox, causes precisely the type of pitting seen on Ramesses V's face. And more importantly, there's no record of trauma, no evidence of poison, and no alternative cause of death. It's not just the body that tells the story. The context does too. During Ramesses V's reign, Egypt was dealing with widespread unrest. Tomb robberies were increasing. Grain shortages were reported in state records. Some historians speculate that these weren't just political problems, they were public health issues. Epidemics have a way of magnifying existing instability, of turning drought into famine and fear into chaos. There are hints in the Harris Papyrus and other documents that suggest disease was present in the land, though ancient Egyptian sources, famously opaque about royal weaknesses, never admit that a pharaoh died of illness. Because pharaohs weren't supposed to die of disease, not visibly anyway. Illness implied weakness, mortality. The divine made human, so if Ramesses V did die of smallpox, it would have been quietly devastating, not just to the body, but to the myth. And then there's the question of the funeral, or lack thereof. Something strange happened after Ramesses V died. His tomb appears to have been left unfinished. Paintings abruptly stop mid-stroke. Decorative panels remain blank. There are signs that someone returned later to finish the job, possibly his successor, Ramesses VI, who repurposed the same tomb for his own burial. It's as if Ramesses V died suddenly, or under such chaotic circumstances that the usual 70-day embalming ritual was cut short. Some archaeologists even argue that the tomb wasn't fully sealed when he was buried, an unthinkable break from tradition. Could it have been an epidemic? A rush to bury the infected? A fear that even the embalming priests might catch what killed the king? We can't be sure, but it's the gaps, the unfinished walls, the vague funerary inscriptions, the silent body that leave the question hanging. And centuries later, that same body would end up in a glass case at the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, where curious visitors stare at the pockmarked face of a long-dead god-king, trying to decide whether those spots mean what they think they mean. Science, for its part, remains politely uncertain. The official verdict? Probable smallpox. But history doesn't move on probabilities. It moves on myths, and this one, this pharaoh disfigured by disease, lingers like a curse no one wants to name. But while Ramesses V might be the earliest victim of a global killer, he wasn't the only royal entangled in a medical mystery. Because deep in a golden tomb, beneath painted ceilings and mythic narratives, lay a boy king whose bones tell a very different story. Not of plague, but of something worse, royal fragility disguised as divine inheritance. If you're still here, 2 mysteries in, welcome to the deep end. We've got 25 more royal riddles to go, and they only get darker from here. So hit subscribe, tap the bell, and drop a comment. Where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Midnight? Noon? Somewhere in between? Let's see how far this empire of insomniacs really stretches. 3. Tutankhamun, Pharaoh of Egypt, DC 1323 BCE. His name is everywhere now, on souvenir mugs, in documentaries, in breathless museum exhibits. Tutankhamun, the boy king, the golden mask, the mummy that launched 1,000 myths. For a pharaoh who barely ruled a decade and left behind no pyramids, his fame is oddly disproportionate. But the real mystery isn't the grandeur of his burial. It's the quiet, disjointed tragedy of his death. When Howard Carter cracked open the tomb in 1922, the world marveled at the riches. Gold shrines, chariots, daggers, furniture, statues, all untouched by grave robbers. It was the best preserved royal burial ever found in Egypt's Valley of the Kings. But behind the shimmering mask, beneath layers of linen, was a body that had long since given up its secrets, or so they thought. What killed Tutankhamun? That's the question that's haunted historians, doctors, and conspiracy theorists for over a century. And the deeper they dig, the stranger the answers become. First, let's start with what we don't know. We don't know what Tutankhamun was like as a person. We don't know how he ruled or if he even had much say in his reign at all. Most of his policies were reversals of his father Akhenaten's radical religious reforms, meaning the grown-ups were cleaning up theological messes while the boy king sat in a gilded chair. He ascended the throne at around 9 years old. He was dead by 18 or 19, a short life and a shorter reign. But the aftermath was longer. Tutankhamun's body was in bad shape when it was found, charred in parts, broken in others, brittle to the point of crumbling. At first, this was blamed on ancient embalmers or the passage of time, but later modern forensic investigations began to reveal something more complicated, a cascade of medical problems hiding inside the royal frame. In 2005, a team led by Egyptian archaeologist Zahi Hawass performed a CT scan of the mummy. What they found wasn't reassuring. Tutankhamun had a clubbed left foot, a bone disease, and evidence of necrosis in the bones of his foot. This wasn't a robust young warrior. This was a limping teenager who needed a cane to walk. In fact, over 130 walking sticks were found in his tomb. Some were clearly used. This was a king who lived with pain, but physical disability alone doesn't kill, so the team kept digging genetically this time. In 2010, a study published in JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association, tried to sequence the DNA of Tutankhamun and several of his relatives. The findings added yet another strange layer. He had malaria. More specifically, Plasmodium falciparum, the most virulent strain. Combine that with his fragile bones and a hypothesis emerged. The young pharaoh may have died of complications from malaria, exacerbated by a vascular necrosis, the death of bone tissue due to limited blood supply. In other words, his body was breaking down from within. But, as with anything involving kings and coffins, the story refuses to sit still. Some argue that a broken leg, possibly caused by a fall, became infected and led to death. Others point to the royal inbreeding revealed by the DNA studies. Tutankhamun's parents were likely full siblings, and while royal incest was not unusual in ancient Egypt, it preserved the bloodline, or so they believed. It came at a cost. Modern genetics tells us that such unions drastically increase the risk of inherited disorders, immune deficiencies, and structural abnormalities. So, was it malaria, a genetic disease, a broken leg, all of the above? None of them quite add up. His health was fragile, certainly, but something about the narrative still doesn't feel complete. His burial, for example, was rushed. His tomb was small by royal standards, almost makeshift. His death, clearly unexpected. Some Egyptologists believe he wasn't supposed to die so soon, that his tomb was meant for someone else, maybe a lesser noble, maybe an unfinished plan B. And then there's the embalmer's mistake, one rarely discussed in museum gift shops. Tutankhamun's body appears to have spontaneously combusted inside the coffin, not as a supernatural curse, but because of the resins used during mummification. The mixture of oils, bandages, and heat in the sealed tomb created a chemical reaction that literally baked the body. That's why parts of him were burned. That's why the preservation is poor. The irony, the damage only deepened the mystery. The physical evidence is corrupted, the DNA degraded, the clues twisted by accident and time. And that brings us back to the boy himself. Tutankhamun, pharaoh of the 18th dynasty, ruler of Egypt, treated as a god in life, reduced to a jigsaw puzzle in death. His golden mask is flawless. His body was not, and maybe that's the true heart of the mystery, the tension between divine image and mortal fragility. Tutankhamun didn't conquer empires or build cities. His fame came later, from the silence he left behind. But if the boy king died in quiet confusion, the next royal on our journey went out in painful public horror. His name was Herod. His symptoms, so bizarre, even modern medicine hesitates to make eye contact. 4. Herod the Great, king of Judea, died 4 BCE. By the time Herod the Great began to die, he had already built half of Judea into stone. Palaces on hillsides, temples made of imported marble, aqueducts stretching across deserts, and most famously, a second temple expansion in Jerusalem so grand that even his enemies grudgingly admired it. He ruled with brutality, yes, but also with brilliance. A political animal par excellence, Herod had outlasted multiple Roman emperors, navigated a minefield of regional alliances, and held a volatile kingdom together with a mix of concrete, paranoia, and spectacle. And then, one day, his body began to betray him. The account of Herod's death doesn't come from a modern physician, but from an ancient chronicler, Flavius Josephus, a Jewish historian writing in the 1st century AD century CE. Josephus didn't hold back. He described the king's final months in morbid detail, listing an array of symptoms that even today reads more like a riddle than a diagnosis. Herod, Josephus tells us, suffered from intense abdominal pain, difficulty breathing, uncontrollable itching, and a gangrenous condition in his genitals. His breath was foul, his limbs were swollen, his skin blistered. The man who had ruled through terror now writhed in it. Modern historians and medical sleuths have tried to translate this ancient horror story into modern terms. The leading candidates: chronic kidney disease complicated by Fournier's gangrene, a rare, fast-spreading infection that attacks soft tissue, particularly in the lower abdomen and groin. Others have suggested scabies, diabetes, or even bowel cancer with secondary infections, but none of these explanations account for the sheer variety and extremity of Herod's symptoms. And perhaps that's the point. Herod was not an ordinary man, and his death was not an ordinary one. He had spent his life accumulating power through a unique combination of Roman loyalty and regional ruthlessness. He had his wife executed, 3 of his sons, advisors, generals, family members, all purged when he sensed disloyalty. This wasn't simply governance. It was a lifelong campaign of preemptive survival, and in a way his body followed suit, as if his organs had formed their own mutiny. But here's where things turn more than medical, because Herod, even in dying, remained Herod. Knowing death was near, he made a series of final paranoid moves. He had prominent Jewish leaders imprisoned in Jericho under orders that they should be executed upon his death to ensure national mourning. He revised his will twice. He summoned physicians, then ignored them. He arranged one last assassination attempt against a son, and when that failed, tried again. In short, Herod didn't go quietly, and neither did the legend, because layered on top of Josephus's account is the biblical portrayal, the Herod of the massacre of the innocents, the tyrant said to have ordered the execution of every male infant in Bethlehem upon hearing of the birth of a future king of the Jews. Whether or not that story is historically verifiable, it amplified the mythology. Herod the Builder, Herod the Killer, Herod the Cursed, which brings us back to his death. Let's say, for the sake of analysis, that it was chronic kidney disease with an added infection, likely the modern consensus. That alone would have produced many of the symptoms Josephus described: fluid retention, mental confusion, uremic breath, skin changes. Add an aggressive infection like Fournier's, and you get tissue decay, swelling, and systemic collapse. But what you also get, tellingly, is prolonged suffering. A slow death, not a noble fade to black, but a dragged-out unraveling. And maybe, just maybe, that's the real diagnosis, poetic irony. Herod, who tried to control everything, his lineage, his enemies, his image, even how others would grieve for him, couldn't control the one thing that truly mattered: his own exit. His final days were a study in the limits of empire, not military failure, not assassination, but the slow, indifferent decay of biology. A king brought low not by rebellion, but by his own cells. He died in Jericho, sometime in 4 BCE, surrounded by doctors who had no answers and courtiers who were quietly watching the clock. Within days, riots erupted. His carefully constructed succession plan fell apart. The territory was split. Rome got involved. The empire he'd spent decades sculpting began to fray before his body was even cold. And yet Herod's death left behind more than instability. It left a model, a pattern. Because across history you'll find a peculiar genre of royal suffering, grand architects of kingdoms brought down by inexplicable afflictions. In Herod's case, the disease was strange. In the next king's case, it was unmistakable, and yet it rewrote the very idea of what it meant to rule while decaying. Because the next royal in this chain didn't just suffer, he reigned while dissolving. He ruled Jerusalem as his body failed, piece by piece, decade by decade. 5. Baldwin IV, the leper, King of Jerusalem, Boshua 1174 to 1185. He was crowned at 13, buried at 24, and remembered forever by a single word, leper. Baldwin IV, King of Jerusalem during the height of the Crusader kingdoms, is one of those historical figures whose life seems scripted by fate, if fate had a flair for irony. He ruled in a land obsessed with purity, power, and divine favor, and he did so while carrying the one disease most associated with sin, exile, and untouchability. But Baldwin wasn't born sick. That would have been too easy. He was a prince first, the son of Amalric I of Jerusalem, raised in the court of Outremer, educated by tutors, trained in politics and warfare, like any other heir to a throne carved from blood and theology. According to his tutor, the historian William of Tyre, the first sign that something was wrong came when the young Baldwin felt no pain. Not metaphorically, literally. He couldn't feel pain in his right arm. He could be pinched, scratched, even burned, and he wouldn't react. That wasn't bravery. That was neuropathy. William of Tyre wrote it down with a scholar's restraint, but even then, the alarm was clear. This wasn't a passing illness. This was Hansen's disease, what the medieval world called leprosy. And in the 12th century, that wasn't just a diagnosis, it was a verdict. Leprosy was the disease of the unclean, the punished, the cursed. In Europe and the Levant, lepers were often expelled from cities, forced to wear bells or clappers to announce their presence. They weren't just considered sick, they were considered spiritually contagious. Their presence was a reminder that flesh rots, kingdoms fall, and even divine favor has limits. But Baldwin IV was not expelled. He was crowned. That's the first twist in his story, how a visibly ill teenager was permitted to rule at all. The Kingdom of Jerusalem was in a precarious position at the time, surrounded by Muslim powers, dependent on European support, and prone to internal factionalism. The nobles had every reason to block a leper king, but they didn't, possibly because Baldwin, despite his illness, was sharp, politically astute, and, for a time, physically able to lead. In fact, he fought. In 1177, at the Battle of Mongkut, Baldwin, just 16 years old, led his forces in a surprise attack against the vastly larger army of Saladin. Against all odds, the Christian forces won. It was a brief but brilliant victory, and it cemented Baldwin's reputation as something more than a tragic figure. He wasn't a sick boy in a golden chair. He was a strategist, a king. And that complicated the public image of his disease. But the disease didn't pause for politics. Over the next 8 years, Baldwin's health declined in quiet increments. His fingers curled inward, his feet became less reliable, his face grew pockmarked, pale. At times he was carried on a litter, at others he rode veiled to hide the wilds. Toll, he continued to govern, sometimes directly, sometimes through regents, but always with the looming knowledge that time was running out. What makes Baldwin IV's reign so haunting is the juxtaposition between external power and internal decay. This was a king who signed treaties, managed succession plans, and outmaneuvered palace factions while gradually losing his body. A boy trying to manage the balance of Christian and Muslim power in the Levant while knowing that he would never live to see how it played out. His court knew it too. There was a growing scramble for control of the future over his heir, his sister Sibylla, and her marriage prospects. Baldwin himself tried to orchestrate a smooth transition of power, naming his nephew Baldwin V as co-king before his death. It didn't work. Civil war followed soon after. Jerusalem fell to Saladin in 1187, just 2 years after Baldwin IV was buried in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And that's the irony. Baldwin's body may have failed, but his mind did not. He saw the fall coming and tried to prevent it. He made political compromises, rearranged family alliances, and even sidelined his own sister to protect the kingdom's future. But the body politic, like the human body, is not so easily controlled. Historians now recognize Baldwin IV as one of the most capable kings of the Crusader states, not because of military conquests, though he had those, but because of his clear-eyed pragmatism. He understood the limits of his time, his body and his court. He ruled not with divine right, but with strategic clarity. A leper king in an age obsessed with signs from God somehow became the most rational man in the room. And still, it wasn't enough. His death marked the beginning of the end for Christian Jerusalem. The careful balance he had maintained collapsed in his absence. But the legacy of Baldwin IV lingers in the historical margins, a reminder that even those labelled as cursed can be crowned, and that power sometimes wears a mask of illness. Yet if Baldwin's illness was visible, progressive, and diagnosed in his own time, the next royal on our list wasn't nearly so lucky. Because what happens when disease is invisible, inherited, and silently ticking across generations? When the symptoms are not on the skin, but in the bloodline itself? Ask the Hapsburgs. Or better yet, start with the last strangest king to carry their name. 6. Charles II of Spain, Riki 1665 to 1700. He was called El Hechizado, the Bewitched, not by poets, not by enemies, but by his own people. And not because of something he did, but because of what he was. An enigma in flesh, a medical paradox with a crown. Charles II of Spain, the last Habsburg monarch of the Spanish line, didn't just rule in decline, he was the decline. The end of a dynasty written not in blood, but in genes. You didn't need a physician to see it. From birth, Charles was visibly unwell. His body was frail, his jaw jutted unnaturally forward, his tongue too large for his mouth. He suffered from seizures, digestive issues, muscle weakness, and a cognitive delay that made royal tutors quietly revise their expectations. The Habsburg dynasty, by then centuries old, had already accumulated the baggage of its own success. A long-standing policy of intra-family marriage meant that Charles was the product of generations of cousin-to-cousin unions. By modern reckoning, his inbreeding coefficient was higher than that of a child born to sibling parents. But in the 17th century, no one talked about genetics. They talked about curses. Charles became king at the age of 4, a child king with a collapsing empire and an aristocracy more focused on court rituals than governance. He was sheltered, ceremonial, and according to the surviving letters from ambassadors and courtiers, completely unprepared for power. But more than that, he was sick, chronically, strangely sick, and no one could agree on why. Throughout his life, Charles suffered from periodic neurological episodes, unexplained fevers, speech and mobility impairments, and a near-total absence of reproductive ability. He married twice. Neither marriage produced an heir. Courtiers whispered about impotency. Priests muttered about demonic forces. Doctors offered contradictory treatments, ranging from exorcisms to powdered herbs, none of which worked. Behind all of this, the Spanish Empire was crumbling. Gold from the New World was drying up. The economy was collapsing under the weight of war debt and royal inefficiency. The court, once a centre of European influence, had become a labyrinth of intrigue. But Charles, locked inside a failing body and a failing system, seemed unable to do more than watch it happen. It wasn't entirely his fault. In fact, it's hard to blame Charles at all. Modern studies suggest he may have suffered from multiple hereditary conditions, among them mandibular prognathism, the infamous Hapsburg jaw, epilepsy, hypergonadism, and perhaps even mitochondrial disorders. His autopsy, conducted after his death at the age of 38, claimed, without subtlety, that his body did not contain a single drop of blood, that his heart was the size of a peppercorn, and that his intestines were rotten and gangrenous. While these descriptions are clearly coloured by superstition and courtly bias, the overall picture remains. This was a man whose internal systems had quietly failed him from the start. But the real drama wasn't just medical, it was geopolitical. With no heir, the question of Charles's succession became the defining crisis of European diplomacy. France and Austria, the two main claimants via competing royal marriages, circled like vultures. The War of Spanish Succession was already casting shadows over the continent. Every twitch of Charles's health became news. Every failed attempt to conceive an heir was a state emergency. In one of his more lucid moments, Charles reportedly tried to name a successor who might avoid bloodshed. But it didn't matter. When he died in 1700, the throne was contested immediately. The Bourbon Philip of Anjou, backed by France, claimed the crown. So did the Austrian Habsburgs. The war that followed engulfed much of Europe and redrew the map for the next century. And yet, through all this, through the fevers, the court politics, the eerie silences of a king who often stared blankly at ambassadors, there's a strange humanity in Charles's story. He wasn't a tyrant, he wasn't a fool. He was a man born into a position his body couldn't sustain. A king in name, ruled more by doctors, priests, and relatives than by his own will. He tried, in his own quiet way, to fulfill the image of majesty. He attended court, he signed documents, he received foreign dignitaries, he wore the crown. But the body underneath the velvet never matched the myth. And in a world that demanded divine strength from its monarchs, Charles's weakness became a kind of public spectacle, both feared and pitied. But if Charles was undone by his bloodline, the next monarch in our descent into royal illness would suffer from something far more abstract and yet equally devastating. Not something in the body exactly, but something in the mind. A king whose descent into so-called madness blurred the lines between monarchy and medicine, power and delusion, and whose ghost still haunts every padded room in the history of royal medicine. 7. George III of Great Britain, arm 1760 to 1820. He was the king who lost America. The monarch whose face was printed on redcoats' currency and whose name was shouted in revolutionary pamphlets across the Atlantic. But long after the musket smoke cleared, long after the colonies had declared independence and the war was lost, George III remained king of Britain, of Ireland, of memory, and eventually of madness. At least that's the word his contemporaries used. Madness, an all-purpose 18th century umbrella for any behaviour that veered too far from the genteel image of royal composure. And George, to be fair, did veer. But the story of his illness is more than the image of a man shouting at shadows or conversing with invisible companions. It's the story of a monarch whose life slowly fractured under the weight of hereditary vulnerability, medical misunderstanding, and the unbearable expectations of power. And it's also, in its own unsettling way, the story of how monarchy itself can become a kind of performance, one that continues long after the performer has left the stage. George III ascended the throne in 1760 at just 22 years old, following the death of his grandfather George II. He was the first of the Hanoverian kings to be born and raised in Britain rather than Germany, a fact that earned him early goodwill. He married Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, had a large family, 15 children to be exact, and projected a wholesome domestic image that contrasted sharply with the indulgent, scandal-ridden courts of many European royals. But beneath the polished exterior, something was already ticking. a slow, unpredictable force that would come to define his legacy more than any policy or battle. The first major episode came in 1788. George began to exhibit signs of severe mental distress, racing thoughts, pressured speech, mood swings, confusion, insomnia, and disinhibition. At times, he talked for hours without stopping. At others, he couldn't be understood at all. He was said to repeat himself obsessively, sometimes refusing to eat or sleep, and occasionally giving contradictory orders. The court, unsure how to interpret this unraveling, turned to its physicians, who, in true 18th century fashion, prescribed everything from bloodletting to purgatives to restraint. One word: ineffective. But perhaps more damaging than the illness itself was the political vacuum it created. A monarch was not just a man, he was the state. If he couldn't govern, who could? The crisis eventually triggered the Regency Bill, a constitutional debate about whether his son, the future George IV, should be installed as regent. The episode ended in early 1789 when George unexpectedly recovered. But the damage to his reputation, his family, and the public image of royal invincibility was already done, and the illness wasn't finished with him yet. Modern medicine has attempted to retrofit George III's condition with a diagnosis. For much of the 20th century, the favoured theory was porphyria, a rare metabolic disorder that can cause neurological symptoms, discoloured urine, and abdominal pain. This theory was popularised by the 1969 book The Purple Secret, which argued that both his physical and mental symptoms matched the disease. Supporters of this theory even cited contemporary accounts of his urine turning dark, though the sources for that detail are shaky at best. More recent scholarship leans in another direction entirely: bipolar disorder, possibly complicated by anxiety and recurrent depressive episodes. George's long stretches of stability, punctuated by acute manic or psychotic episodes, do seem to fit the modern psychiatric framework more cleanly. But the truth is, we'll never know for certain. The king's medical records are fragmentary, the terminology outdated, and the royal household notoriously opaque when it came to matters of health. What we do know is this: the episodes became more frequent with age. By the early 1800s, George was almost entirely incapacitated. His son was formally declared Prince Regent in 1811, effectively ending George III's reign in all but name. For the last decade of his life, he lived in seclusion at Windsor Castle, blind, likely deaf, and increasingly detached from the world. And yet, even in that isolation, George remained a symbol, a figure on coinage, a name in state documents, a monarch in theory, even as the man behind the title disappeared into illness. It's a strange kind of duality, how power can persist without presence, how institutions continue to orbit a centre that's no longer there. George III died in 1820. By then, the world had changed. Napoleon had risen and fallen. The Industrial Revolution was reshaping society, and the empire he once governed was no longer quite his own. He had become a kind of royal relic, remembered less for his policies than for his condition. But maybe that's the real mystery. Not just the illness, but how it redefined the monarchy itself. How a king's vulnerability forced a nation to grapple with the idea that rule does not always mean control, that sovereignty can be maintained even as the sovereign slips away. Still, at least George was eventually understood, even if posthumously. The next royal in our story wasn't afforded such a luxury. Her illness came quickly, invisibly, and with fatal speed. No madness, no exile, just a queen, a fever, and a sudden silence, so sudden it still echoes across her brief, unfinished reign. 8. Mary II of England, Scotland, and Ireland, or 1689 to 1694, she ruled jointly with her husband William of Orange. a rare arrangement in the annals of monarchy, not because two monarchs sharing power was legally impossible, but because it was practically unthinkable. Yet Mary II, daughter of the deposed Catholic King James II, became queen regnant by popular demand, and not merely as a ceremonial consort. She was crowned with William, not beneath him. For 5 short years, she presided over the affairs of the three kingdoms with a kind of quiet competence that history tends to overlook. And then, just as she had stepped fully into her role as sovereign, she was gone. Her death came in winter, swift, abrupt, and cloaked in the same irony that threads its way through so many royal ends. December 1694, a biting cold season in London, and Mary, just 32 years old, was bedridden with what her physicians described as a feverish cold. Within days, it escalated to full-blown crisis. Her skin broke out, her body weakened, her breathing grew difficult. The court panicked, the physicians disagreed, the public worried, but by then there was little left to do. Mary II died not from battle, not from court intrigue, not from years of hereditary decline. She died, most likely, of smallpox, the very disease she had feared since childhood. It wasn't supposed to happen this way. Mary was strong, beloved by the Anglican establishment, and seen as a moral counterpoint to her more politically assertive husband. She was a Protestant queen in an age that demanded it. Her marriage had been a political alliance, but grew, by most accounts, into a genuine partnership. She governed in William's absence when he was abroad. She took counsel, she signed laws, and she navigated a deeply divided post-revolutionary England with grace and tact. Her reign was the product of the Glorious Revolution, a bloodless coup that replaced her father with herself. An inversion of dynastic norms that required careful maintenance of public image. She did it well, until her body failed her. The exact cause of death was not officially confirmed. Some physicians claimed it was a particularly virulent case of smallpox, possibly hemorrhagic in nature, a rare form in which the disease progresses so rapidly and severely that death can come within days, even without the signature rash fully developing. Other observers noted that her symptoms seemed to accelerate with terrifying speed. Chills, high fever, widespread pain, delirium. Whether it was a conventional case or something more rare, the effect was the same. She died childless, and unexpectedly. What made her death so destabilizing wasn't just that she was young. It was that she was central. Her marriage to William III was both a political statement and a constitutional compromise. The Protestant line of succession depended on her. She had no surviving children. Her sister Anne stood next in line, but Anne's own health was fragile, her pregnancies ending in tragedy after tragedy. The question of who would carry the crown forward, if anyone could, reopened old anxieties the Glorious Revolution had supposedly settled. The public reaction was uncharacteristically emotional. This wasn't the usual ceremonial mourning of a distant monarch. Mary had been popular, not just tolerated. She was dignified without being severe, religious without fanaticism, and loyal without making herself invisible. Her public persona had been carefully curated, but it was also genuinely admired. When she died, there were street sermons, unofficial elegies, pamphlets filled with grief. It was a strange kind of mourning, more for potential than for power. And yet, even in death, her role was political. The court carefully orchestrated her funeral, making sure to emphasize her piety, her Protestant virtue, her stability. No scandal, no rumours, just solemnity and loss. Her body lay in state at Whitehall, draped in black velvet and flanked by guards in mourning attire. The funeral procession wound its way through London to Westminster Abbey, where she was buried with royal honours. A moment of stillness in an era not known for it. Historians now look back on Mary's reign with a sense of truncated legacy. She might have governed longer. She might have reconciled further divisions between crown and parliament. She might have brought continuity to a monarchy already showing cracks in its foundations. Instead, her death marked the beginning of another uncertain transition, one that would, in time, lead to the Act of Settlement, the Hanoverian succession, and the constitutional reshaping of monarchy itself. And smallpox, it wasn't done yet. Despite early experiments in inoculation from the East and whispers of variolation among the elite, no cure or prevention had reached the broader population in Mary's time. The virus remained indifferent to title or power. It would go on to claim more royals, more heirs, more empires, and the strange irony is that the monarchy would eventually survive smallpox, but not always the consequences of its timing. Because as Mary's coffin descended into the vault beneath Westminster Abbey, another crown sat on another head, and that head too would bow, not to rebellion, but to a sudden, violent illness in the very same century. A monarch beloved in life, erased by the very disease that power couldn't prevent. 9. Louis XV of France, rule 1715 to 1774. He was once called Louis the Beloved, a title that aged about as well as the monarchy itself. Crowned as a child after the death of his great-grandfather Louis XIV, Louis XV inherited a France that was rich in ceremony, poor in liquidity, and quietly simmering with contradictions. He was 5 years old when he became king, and France, still basking in the long shadow of the Sun King, thought it could shape him into another one. It did not. Instead, Louis XV's reign became a slow unraveling. What began as a monarchy flush with prestige and global ambition ended with a king disillusioned, unpopular, and strangely adrift in his own court. And when he died, it wasn't on the battlefield or under the blade of revolution. It was from something far older, far simpler, and far more revealing. He died of smallpox in 1774. The same disease that had taken queens and emperors for millennia still held its seat in the halls of Versailles. Despite being one of the most documented courts in European history, Louis's final illness was not particularly well hidden. That wasn't the style at Versailles. His decline was noted, whispered about, observed by courtiers and servants alike. A royal body was a national concern, and his was failing in real time. What makes his death so intriguing isn't just the cause, it's the context. By the 18th century, smallpox wasn't just feared, it was familiar. Everyone knew someone who had it. Survivors bore the scars, physical and social. The disease could maim or kill with equal efficiency, and the rules were simple. You either lived through it or you didn't. But for royals, things were supposed to be different. In fact, they had options. Because by Louis XV's time, variolation had arrived in France. Variolation was the precursor to vaccination, an early form of inoculation that involved exposing someone to a controlled dose of smallpox, usually through a skin incision, to provoke immunity. Risky, yes, but often effective. By the mid-17th century, it was gaining ground in elite medical circles. The British royal family had adopted it. So had members of the French aristocracy. But Louis, he hesitated. He was reportedly skeptical of variolation, as were many in the French court. There were theological objections, scientific doubts, and a deeply entrenched belief in the sanctity of the royal body, that the king's blood was not to be tampered with. Medicine, in this view, was not a tool for prevention, but for appearances. Public health hadn't yet entered the royal vocabulary. So when smallpox arrived at Versailles in 1774, it did what smallpox does. It spread quickly. Louis XV first showed symptoms in late April. A rash, fatigue, fever. At first, physicians hoped it was something else, anything else. But within days, the nature of the illness became clear. The court was thrown into chaos. Ministers whispered of contingency plans. Servants began leaving the palace. His daughters were banned from his bedside. One by one, The tapestries of royal ritual were peeled away, leaving only a sick man in a gilded room. There's a detail from this period that tends to stick in the memory. The king's body began to emit an odour so strong that many refused to stay in the same room. Whether this is courtly exaggeration or an honest observation of the disease's progression, it paints a bleak picture. The man who had once ruled one of the most opulent courts in Europe now lay increasingly alone, his mortality impossible to disguise. He died on May the 10th, 1774, at the Palace of Versailles. And the people of Paris? They cheered. Gone was Louis the Beloved. What remained was a king associated with debauchery, expensive wars, mistresses, and a general sense of national drift. France had suffered under his watch. The 7 Years' War had drained the treasury, lost colonies, and humiliated the army. The seeds of the French Revolution were already germinating, and while Louis XV didn't live to see the harvest, he certainly helped fertilize the soil. But his death did spark one important shift. His grandson, the future Louis XVI, was variolated almost immediately. The suddenness of Louis XV's death had served as a wake-up call. Royal immunity was a myth, and smallpox did not respect bloodlines. The science, imperfect as it was, offered the only chance at prevention. It's a cruel irony that it took one king's death to protect another. Still, Louis XV's story stands as a kind of inflection point, not because of how he died, many had died the same way, but because of what his death revealed, that even in palaces of gold and mirrors, viruses don't bow to titles. His reign had been defined by hesitation, miscalculation, and the slow erosion of public trust. His final illness only made it literal, and that legacy, strangely enough, would echo beyond France, because smallpox had no borders. The next ruler to fall to it would die in the heart of the Holy Roman Empire, surrounded by doctors' heirs and a growing awareness that even emperors weren't immune to the oldest monarch of all, disease itself. 10. Joseph I, Holy Roman Emperor, 1705 to 1711. He was a Hapsburg emperor with the face of a Roman statue and the ambitions to match. Joseph I, crowned Holy Roman Emperor in 1705, was supposed to be the future of Europe's most labyrinthine dynasty. Tall, handsome, multilingual, and unusually well-read for a monarch of his time, he was the kind of sovereign who looked good on currency and even better in diplomatic portraits. He had everything a ruler was supposed to have, except time. Because in 1711, at just 32 years old, Joseph I died, and the cause was the same thing that had haunted his childhood, stalked his court, and hovered over every dynastic negotiation of the era. Smallpox, not a duel, not a war, not a coup, but the virus that quietly waited behind curtains and courtiers, undeterred by armor or treaties. And with Joseph, it struck with speed. The illness began in March of that year, during a period of relative political calm. Calm, of course, being a highly relative term in the early 18th century Hapsburg court. Joseph was mid-reign, embroiled in the War of the Spanish Succession, and deeply involved in the bureaucratic machinery of empire. He had reformist tendencies. He wanted to modernize the army, reduce internal corruption, and streamline the imperial administration. His court was lively, his ambitions were clear, and then he fell ill. At first it looked like a fever, a common enough occurrence in a palace full of candles, velvet, and questionable hygiene. But within days, the signs were unmistakable. Blotches, a rising temperature, debilitating fatigue. Joseph had been exposed to variola major, the deadliest strain of smallpox, and he showed no signs of immunity. Ironically, he might have expected this. Joseph had lost his younger brother, Archduke Charles Joseph, to smallpox when they were both children. It was a trauma that shaped his youth and, according to some accounts, made him deeply fearful of disease. But for reasons unclear, perhaps hesitation, perhaps tradition, Joseph himself had never undergone variolation, the primitive but increasingly popular method of immunization that had begun to circulate among elite European families. His court, despite its ambitions, remained conservative when it came to medical innovation. The illness progressed quickly. Within 10 days, Joseph I was incapacitated. He tried to continue ruling from bed, but the severity of the disease overwhelmed him. Accounts from the court describe a rapid decline, the emperor's strength vanishing, his voice faltering, his appearance changing in ways his doctors refused to describe in detail. On April the 17th, 1711, he died. Just like that, gone. The man who had been groomed to reshape the Holy Roman Empire, a leader seen as a bridge between traditional monarchy and Enlightenment reform, was reduced to a historical asterisk. Not by war or scandal, but by a virus that had already claimed thousands, and would claim millions more before it was finished. But Joseph's death wasn't just a family tragedy, it was a geopolitical catastrophe. The War of the Spanish Succession, already a convoluted affair involving multiple claimants, alliances and continents, was suddenly thrown into chaos. Joseph had no surviving sons. His only brother Charles, the same Charles who had been fighting for the Spanish crown, now stood to inherit the Holy Roman Empire as well, which meant that if he won the war in Spain, he would become Emperor and King of Spain, a concentration of Hapsburg power that no one in Europe wanted, least of all Britain and France. Joseph's sudden death forced a re-evaluation of the entire war effort. Charles eventually did inherit the imperial crown, becoming Charles VI. But the idea of a unified Spanish-Austrian empire under a single Habsburg was quietly shelved. Diplomatic pressures mounted, treaties were rewritten, and the war, already dragging on longer than anyone had predicted, was nudged toward a conclusion that preserved balance, if not satisfaction. And in the middle of it all, the memory of Joseph faded rapidly. He became a kind of political footnote, the young reformer who almost was, the monarch who flirted with modernization but didn't live long enough to see it through. His reign is often overshadowed by the turbulence that followed it, and his death is cited more for its political implications than for the man himself. But there's something telling in how quietly he left the stage. Here was a ruler born into privilege, educated for power, and committed, at least in theory, to the improvement of a fragmented empire. And still, a single strain of virus undid it all. His courts were gilded. His blood was imperial. His documents were sealed with wax and Latin script. None of it mattered, because smallpox, like history, didn't care about potential. It's tempting to think of Joseph as one of the last emperors to die from something so primal. But the truth is, the virus wasn't done, not even close. The next ruler to fall would do so in an eerie echo of Joseph's fate, young, promising, and undone at the very moment the crown was within reach. Only this time, it wouldn't be in Vienna, it would be in Russia. On a wedding day. 11. Peter II of Russia, Emperor 1727 to 1730. He was born into power, but not into certainty. Peter II of Russia, grandson of Peter the Great, inherited one of the most volatile thrones in European history at the tender age of 11, and held onto it for just under 3 years. His reign was short, uneven, and more ceremonial than sovereign. He was a boy emperor, manipulated by factions, flanked by advisors, and treated more like a symbol than a strategist. But the truly strange part of Peter's story isn't how he ruled, it's how he died. In 1730, at just 14 years old, Peter II was set to be married. The match was arranged, of course. This was Imperial Russia, not a romantic novel, but by all accounts, it was politically advantageous. The bride-to-be, Princess Ekaterina Dolgorukova, came from one of the most powerful aristocratic families in the empire. The Dolgorokovs were poised to cement their influence, and the young emperor, barely into adolescence, was poised to begin the next chapter of his rule. There were plans for a grand wedding. The court was ready, the guest list was confirmed, and then, just days before the ceremony, Peter developed a fever. It wasn't unusual. Russia in January was a cocktail of cold weather, overpopulated palaces, and underdeveloped medicine. Illnesses came and went, but this one didn't go. Within hours, the emperor's condition worsened. He became weak, disoriented, barely able to stand. Physicians were summoned, diagnoses were vague. Treatments, as usual, consisted of heated rooms, herbal concoctions, and hopeful guessing. By the second day, the truth had become impossible to avoid. Peter II had smallpox, and in a twist that now feels almost literary, he died on the very day his wedding was scheduled, January 30th, 1730. The marriage never happened. The throne was empty. The empire, once again, was adrift. The timing of Peter's death was not just tragic, it was historically catastrophic. Russia's political system at the time was a powder keg of noble factions, leftover reformist energies from Peter the Great, and a complicated relationship between court aristocracy and autocratic rule. Peter II had been placed on the throne largely because he was malleable, easier to guide than to follow. His death reopened a question that had haunted Russia for generations. Who should rule when dynastic lines grow thin and bodies fall before their time? There were no legitimate male Romanovs left in the immediate succession. The crown would ultimately go to Anna Ivanovna, daughter of Peter the Great's half-brother, but not before the nobles tried to negotiate a constitutional-style agreement that would limit her power. That effort failed dramatically, and Anna's reign marked a return to autocracy. But the point is clear. Peter's death didn't just end a childhood, it threatened to unravel the empire. What makes Peter II's case especially unsettling is how little he seems to have understood the stakes. He was, after all, a teenager. His education had been neglected. His time was spent riding horses, attending banquets, and obeying whichever advisor had his ear that week. By the time smallpox came for him, he had barely begun to realize what being emperor meant, and perhaps that's the cruel symmetry of his life. A child king, dying of a childhood illness, on the cusp of a marriage that would have made him finally an adult ruler. Instead, the court was forced to scramble. The Dolgorokovs, who had bet everything on their daughter's elevation to empress, were suddenly out of favor. Their influence collapsed overnight. Peter's body was quietly buried in the Archangel Cathedral in the Kremlin, making him the only Romanov emperor not buried in the Peter and Paul Cathedral in St. Petersburg. An outlier, even in death, and smallpox still undefeated. Despite its prevalence, the disease remained elusive to prevention. Russia would not embrace inoculation until decades later, long after Western Europe had begun to experiment with variolation and, eventually, vaccination. Even then, suspicion lingered. Royal deaths like Peter's weren't just family tragedies, they were institutional failures, reminders that even in the heart of power, medicine was still more art than science. Peter's reign is now a historical parenthesis. A brief pause between titans of Russian autocracy. He passed no major laws, led no wars, and wrote no manifestos. But his death, sudden, symbolic, and destabilizing, left a mark that far outlasted his rule. A boy raised in opulence, cut down by something as invisible and ancient as a virus. He died alone on the day meant to celebrate his union, and the empire, caught off guard once again, had to improvise its future. But the pattern didn't end with him, because across the Baltic, in a court of cold splendor and Scandinavian intrigue, another monarch was about to meet the same fate. A queen this time, crowned, beloved, and felled by the same merciless hand. 12. Ulrika Eleonora of Sweden, Queen Regnant, 1718 to 1720. She ruled not as Queen Consort, but as Queen Regnant. Ulrika Eleonora of Sweden, sovereign in her own right. a rare political anomaly in a kingdom where power was almost always coded in male lineage and military muscle. Her reign was short, her death quieter still. But what makes Ulrika's story strange isn't how she ruled, it's how she stopped ruling and how, not long after, she stopped living. This is the story of a queen who died not from politics, nor betrayal, nor time, but from smallpox yet again. By the early 18th century, it had become a recurring guest in royal households. In some places, it was met with resignation, in others, with science. In Sweden, it still walked through palace doors unchallenged. Ulrika was born into the heart of Swedish royalty in 1688, the youngest child of King Charles I and Queen Ulrika Eleonora the Elder. Her name was a blend of dynasties, a nod to maternal heritage and political symmetry. But as the youngest daughter, she was never meant to rule. Her older siblings stood in line before her, and the Swedish throne was still deeply tethered to masculine inheritance and battlefield credentials. That changed in 1718, with the sudden death of her brother Charles XII, a king best remembered for his military campaigns and his stubborn refusal to marry or name an heir. Charles died, ironically fittingly, on the battlefield, shot in the head during a siege in Norway. Whether by enemy bullet or internal conspiracy remains debated, but the effect was the same. The Swedish throne was suddenly empty, and the line of succession was awkward. Ulrika stepped in. She wasn't the obvious choice. The Swedish constitution had no clear provision for female succession in that generation, but Ulrika made her case. She claimed the throne by hereditary right, not as a regent or placeholder, and remarkably, the Riksdag, the Swedish parliament, accepted it. With conditions, of course. She had to abdicate most royal power. Her reign marked the beginning of what would be called the Age of Liberty, a political period in Sweden defined by parliamentary governance and curtailed royal authority. In exchange for the crown, Ulrika relinquished the absolute monarchy her brother had wielded. It was a trade she accepted, perhaps because it was the only way to secure the throne, perhaps because she knew the limits of royal power in an age increasingly defined by compromise. Still, her reign didn't last long. After just 2 years, in 1720, Ulrika voluntarily abdicated in favour of her husband, Frederick I. The reasons remain murky. Some say she wanted to maintain influence behind the scenes without the burdens of rulership. Others argue that court pressures pushed her out, that her reign had been a symbolic transition all along. She lived on for 2 more decades as queen consort, mostly sidelined, occasionally consulted, and largely respected, if not politically powerful. Then, in 1741, smallpox arrived again. Sweden had suffered periodic outbreaks for centuries. The disease was common, but no less feared for its frequency. Among the nobility, rumours of variolation had begun to circulate, this idea that a controlled infection might grant immunity. But the practice remained controversial in Sweden, both medically and theologically. Some saw it as tampering with divine judgment. Others saw it as a risk not worth taking. Ulrika Eleonora, ever cautious, was not inoculated. She was 52 years old when symptoms appeared. A high fever, fatigue, and soon the telltale signs of infection. The court quickly realized what it was, but unlike previous centuries, when disease was wrapped in mystery and cloaked in superstition, smallpox in Ulrika's time was fully legible. They knew what it was. They just couldn't stop it. She died on November 24, 1741, in Stockholm. What makes her death quietly tragic is how unremarkable it was, at least to those around her. A former queen, no longer in power, dying of an ordinary disease in an extraordinary place. The official record makes little fuss. Her funeral was respectful but subdued. She was buried in the Riddarholm church alongside Sweden's other royals, her name etched into stone beside kings and conquerors. And yet, Ulrika's death marks something stranger than a royal obituary. It's a kind of symbolic echo, a reminder that even monarchs who escape the throne cannot escape the systems that define them. Her rule had been brief, limited, almost experimental. Her death, by contrast, was textbook. A woman born into power, handed a crown, and then undone by the same microscopic force that had stalked empires since antiquity. By the time Ulrika died, smallpox had taken dozens of royals across Europe. And it wasn't finished, because just south in the warming courts of Bourbon Spain, another youthful monarch, this one barely old enough to know he wore a crown, was living on borrowed time. A king with no legacy. Just a fever, a rash, and 7 months to leave his mark. 13. Louis I of Spain. 1724, 7 months. That's all he had. Louis I of Spain holds the curious distinction of being one of Europe's shortest reigning monarchs, a king who came to power as a teenager and exited the world before his royal signature had time to dry on any meaningful decree. In life, he was known more for potential than policy. In death, he became another entry in Smallpox's royal resume, a quiet but precise reminder that even the grandest throne means little to a microorganism with no regard for succession. Louisa was born in 1707, the eldest son of Philip V of Spain, the first Bourbon to sit on the Spanish throne. Philip, a grandson of France's Louis XIV, had come to power after the tumultuous War of the Spanish Succession, a drawn-out contest between major European powers over who would inherit the vast and unstable Spanish Empire after the extinction of the Hapsburg line. The war had ended in compromise. Spain would remain Bourbon, but would cede large portions of its territory in Europe. This made young Louis a figure of international interest the moment he was born. He represented the future of Bourbon Spain, a bridge between French dynastic influence and Spanish political survival. Groomed from an early age to inherit the crown, Louis was raised in a palace atmosphere that was equal parts ceremonial, cautious, and politically charged. By all accounts, he was a studious boy, awkward in public, soft-spoken, and more inclined toward quiet piety than the theatrical posturing that defined many of his European cousins. But in 1724, something unexpected happened. Philip V, known for his long spells of depression, religious obsession, and increasingly erratic behavior, abdicated the throne, naming his 17-year-old son Louis as his successor. Why? Historians still debate it. Some cite Philip's mental health, others suspect behind-the-scenes court maneuvering or a calculated attempt to preserve Bourbon power by installing a younger king while Philip still controlled the levers of influence from behind the curtain. Regardless of motive, the abdication was formal and real. Louis became King of Spain in January 1724, 17 years old, unmarried, politically inexperienced, and in charge of an empire still recovering from decades of war, dynastic reshuffling, and territorial loss. He lasted 229 days. In late August of that year, Louis began showing symptoms of what was first reported as a fever. Initially, the court downplayed the illness, perhaps out of habit, perhaps out of fear. But soon, unmistakable signs appeared. The rash, the fatigue, the quick deterioration. Louis had contracted smallpox, the same disease that had already killed his mother, Maria Louisa of Savoy, years earlier. The irony didn't go unnoticed. Louis had married just months earlier in January to Louise Elisabeth d'Orléans, daughter of the French regent. It was a dynastic match, part of a broader Bourbon strategy to solidify ties between France and Spain. The wedding had been a rushed affair, designed more for politics than sentiment. At the time of his illness, the young queen was still adjusting to her new court, and already drawing criticism for her perceived frivolity and awkward manners. Now she was widowed before the marriage had even found a rhythm. Louis died on August 31, 1724, in Madrid. He was 17. His reign, if one can even call it that, left no major reforms, no great battles, no decisive edicts, just a royal seal, a short stack of ceremonial documents, and a kingdom with more questions than answers. The political fallout was immediate. With no heir and no clear successor, the Spanish court faced a constitutional crisis. But the solution came from the same place the problem had begun. Philip V returned to the throne. His abdication, as it turned out, had not included any legal safeguards preventing a re-ascension. Within days of Louis's funeral, Philip resumed kingship as if he had merely taken an extended sabbatical. It was, historically speaking, an odd maneuver. A king retires, lets his teenage son die in office, then returns to power as if nothing happened. But in early 18th century Spain, where dynastic continuity mattered more than constitutional theory, it worked. The monarchy carried on, quietly, bloodlessly, bureaucratically. But Louis's story never quite fit the narrative. His reign is a kind of royal parenthesis, brief, uncertain, and entirely overshadowed by the deaths and decisions surrounding it. A reminder that sometimes the crown weighs nothing at all. That kingship, for all its grandeur, can be as fleeting as a season. And smallpox, it was still not finished. The disease would continue to make its rounds through the courts of Europe and beyond, carving a path through lineage after lineage, paying no mind to coronation dates or marriage contracts. The next time it struck a throne, it would be half a world away, in a vast empire to the east, where emperors ruled with divine authority and heavenly mandate, but whose palaces were no more immune to contagion than a peasant's hut. 14. Shunzhi Emperor, Qing China R 1643 to 1661. In the palaces of the Forbidden City, truth often travelled slower than rumour and vanished faster than a whisper. Few emperors embodied this tension more than the Shunzhi Emperor, the first Qing ruler to sit on the throne of a fully conquered China. His reign began as a gesture of conquest, but ended in a haze of contradiction, religious devotion, and sudden death, officially from smallpox, though the story, as always, doesn't quite stay inside the medical lines. He was born Fulin, the 9th son of Hong Taiji, heir to the Manchu conquest of the crumbling Ming dynasty. At the tender age of 5, he was declared emperor after his father's death, though real power was held by a regency led by the formidable Dogon, a prince and military commander who had helped complete the conquest of China. The year was 1643. The Qing were new. The capital had just shifted from Shenyang to Beijing. The Forbidden City still echoed with the ghosts of Ming emperors. Shunzhi, crowned amid the ash and dust of dynastic collapse, became the public face of a new order. But he wasn't supposed to be a symbol. He was supposed to live. What followed was a reign marked by contradiction. Shunzhi showed an early interest in governance, rare for emperors who ascended young and ruled under regents. He pushed for reforms, expressed a fascination with Han Chinese culture, and even attempted to soften the brutal edges of Qing military rule. He favored Buddhist monks, questioned Confucian orthodoxy, and, most controversially, developed a fascination with Catholic missionaries at court. He invited Jesuits to the palace, admired their clocks and telescopes, and kept one, Father Adam Shal, as a trusted advisor. For a Manchu emperor ruling over a Han majority, this was politically ambitious. It earned him enemies. So did his efforts to wrest power from Dogon's faction after the regent's death. But Shunzhi endured, making it to adulthood, a rare feat for any ruler born into the aftermath of war. By his mid-teens, he was issuing edicts, patronizing scholars, and expressing an increasingly personal sense of purpose. He married, he fathered children. He began to shape the image of Qing rule beyond military might. And then, in 1661, at just 22 years old, he died. The cause? According to official records, smallpox. And that's where the mystery begins. Smallpox, of course, was no stranger to China. The disease had circulated through the empire for centuries, recorded in medical texts, feared by every stratum of society. But among the Manchus, it held an especially ominous weight. Unlike much of the Han population, who had often been exposed in childhood, the Manchu elite, raised in the colder northeastern steppes, had historically lower rates of immunity. When they marched south to conquer China, they didn't just face Ming loyalists, they faced a microbial threat to which their people were biologically naive. So when Shunzhi fell ill with fever and skin eruptions in early 1661, the court was already on high alert. His symptoms reportedly worsened quickly. Within days, he was incapacitated, then dead. The throne passed to his third son, who would become the Tongzhi Emperor, one of the longest reigning and most influential monarchs in Chinese history. Shunzhi, meanwhile, was mourned in ritual, recorded in the annals, and quietly questioned. Because rumors began to spread, whispers in the corridors of the Forbidden City, letters passed in merchant caravans, coded lines in underground poetry, that Shunzhi hadn't died at all. The most persistent version, that he had faked his death and become a Buddhist monk, retreating to Wutai Mountain to pursue a life of spiritual devotion. This theory gained traction not just because of the secrecy surrounding his illness, but because of Shunzhi's own late-in-life behavior. In the final years of his reign, he had reportedly grown disillusioned with palace life. He spent long hours in private meditation. He hosted Buddhist monks at court. Some said he had planned to abdicate. Others claimed he had confided dreams of escape. The imperial court dismissed these rumors with measured silence. But their refusal to elaborate on the exact nature of his illness, paired with the suddenness of the funeral, the lack of public viewing, and the timing of the succession, left gaps wide enough for centuries of speculation to slip through. Modern historians mostly agree he died of smallpox. The symptoms align, the timing tracks with known outbreaks, and the succession to his son was orderly, if swift. But as with so many deaths behind palace walls, the ambiguity itself became the lasting legacy. Not just what happened, but what wasn't allowed to be said. Shunzhi's death left behind a Qing dynasty poised for greatness, but still haunted by its precarious beginning. His son Kangxi would later become a patron of inoculation, encouraging variolation across China to curb smallpox's relentless toll. But for Shunzhi, it was too late. His death was a reminder that for emperors raised on the illusion of divine mandate, there was no mandate against microbes. Still, Shunzhi wasn't the last Qing ruler to suffer under smallpox's shadow, because a century later, the disease would return. Not in secrecy, but in full imperial spectacle, and take down another young emperor, whose death would ripple through the court like the final act of a prophecy unfulfilled. 15th Tongzhi Emperor, Qing China, EE, 1861 to 1875. The Tongzhi Emperor was born into a palace built on silence. Silence over power, over politics, over the ever-looming collapse of a dynasty that could no longer remember how to rule without pretending it still did. His reign began in name, not in action. He was 5 years old when he became emperor, and by the time he died just before his 19th birthday, he had spent most of his reign as a figurehead behind silk screens, watched over by 2 empress dowagers, one of whom, Cixi, was his mother. And yet, despite being little more than a ceremonial presence in his own government, his death in 1875 managed to stir a controversy that has never fully settled. On paper, the cause was simple and tragically familiar: smallpox. But as with most things involving the imperial court in late Qing China, the surface told only part of the story. Let's start with what's official. The Tongzhi Emperor, born Zaichun in 1856, was the only surviving son of the Xianfeng Emperor and Empress Dowager Cixi. He came to the throne after his father's death in 1861, but the real reins of power were held by the regency of the 2 dowagers, Cixi and Kai An, who ruled through him during his minority. His reign coincided with one of the most critical junctures in Qing history, the aftermath of the Second Opium War, the continuing Taiping Rebellion, and the slow, humiliating encroachment of foreign powers. Through it all, the boy emperor sat quietly in the Forbidden City, learning calligraphy, ritual, and the delicate art of being seen but not heard. When Tongzhi finally came of age and declared his intent to rule independently in 1873, it was less a transfer of power than a polite announcement. Cixi remained the true center of court gravity, and his decisions, what few he made, were often quietly reversed or ignored. His most ambitious project, the so-called Tongzhi Restoration, was a half-hearted attempt to strengthen the empire's institutions through Confucian orthodoxy and military modernization. It never gained traction. Tongzhi was emperor in name, but not in impact. And then came the illness. In late 1874, Tongzhi fell ill. The official diagnosis issued by the imperial court was smallpox, specifically a severe, rapidly progressing form. He had not been inoculated, an odd omission given that the Qing court had by then accepted variolation as standard practice, especially for royalty. In fact, his father had been variolated, and the practice had been promoted during the Kangxi Emperor's reign almost 2 centuries earlier. Why Tongzhi wasn't protected remains one of the more curious blanks in the imperial record. The smallpox theory fit the symptoms: fever, rash, weakness, rapid deterioration. Tongzhi was bedridden for several weeks before dying on January the 12th, 1875. He was 18 years old, but not everyone accepted the official story. Almost immediately after his death, rumors began to circulate. Some whispered that it hadn't been smallpox at all, but a more socially sensitive illness, something inappropriate for public acknowledgement. Others alleged that his death had been politically convenient, pointing to Cixi's reassertion of power almost immediately afterward. There was even speculation that Tongzhi had taken to wandering Beijing's brothels during his brief stint of independent rule, contracting a disease that could not be publicly named in connection with the Son of Heaven. Historians remain divided on the plausibility of these claims. Some argue they were nothing more than the court's way of explaining away a weak ruler's premature death. Others see them as coded criticism of Cixi's increasingly autocratic grip on the throne, a kind of political poetry hidden in whispered diagnosis. But even if the official story was true, and many scholars maintain that it was, the implications were still troubling. A sitting emperor of China, the most exalted human being in the Confucian cosmos, had been allowed to die of a preventable disease, one his own dynasty had spent centuries learning how to mitigate, and not just any emperor, a young one, the last direct male heir of his line. His death triggered an immediate succession crisis, one that had to be resolved by adopting a child from a collateral branch of the family tree, a 3-year-old boy named Zai Tian, soon to be known as the Guangxu Emperor. Cixi, for her part, stepped seamlessly back into power, first as regent for Guangxu, then as his political counterweight for decades to come. Tongzhi's brief reign and his abrupt end were quietly folded into the larger narrative of late Qing decline, a young ruler with no real control, a palace that had stopped protecting its own, a dynasty once again reacting instead of ruling. His tomb, Huiling, stands in the Eastern Qing tombs complex, not far from the grander mausoleums of more consequential emperors. It is a place of stillness, not pilgrimage, a footnote in stone. But the story it tells, or tries not to, lingers. An emperor too young to rule, too constrained to reform, and ultimately too unprotected to survive. A dynasty unwilling to acknowledge its own vulnerabilities, and a disease that even in its fading days could still strike at the very center of a fading empire. Yet Tongzhi was not the first emperor to die under suspicious timing during an epidemic, nor the last to be buried under layers of ceremonial silence, because before him, in an earlier century and a different palace, another emperor had perished in similar fashion, amid rumors, protocols, and the inescapable chill of smallpox closing in. 16th Emperor Kōmei, Japan, E.L., 1846 to 1867. He was the last emperor of Japan to die before the modern age came barging in through the country's tightly shuttered gates. Emperor Kōmei, 121st ruler in the ancient imperial lineage, reigned during a time of deepening cracks in Japan's long-standing policy of isolation. A monarch born into ritual, language, and order, he found himself presiding over a country on the edge of violent transformation, and then, quite suddenly, he died. The official cause? Smallpox again, a word that reads like punctuation in the long sentence of monarchical mortality. But as with most deaths in the palaces of the 19th century, the full stop came with more ellipses than clarity. Kōmei was born in 1831, during the waning years of the Tokugawa shogunate, a time when emperors in Japan did not rule so much as reside. The imperial court, based in Kyoto, was steeped in ceremony, but largely divorced from political power. The real authority rested with the shoguns, and the emperors of the Edo period functioned more like cultural stewards than sovereign rulers. They composed poetry, they observed ancient rites, they lived behind sliding screens draped in silk surrounded by incense and imperial calendars. Kōmei, however, was not content with this arrangement. From the beginning of his reign in 1846, Kōmei displayed unusual interest in national affairs. He objected to the increasing pressure from Western powers to open Japan's borders. He opposed the 1854 Treaty of Kanagawa, signed by the Tokugawa regime with the United States under Commodore Perry's threat of gunboat diplomacy. Where many in the shogunate saw strategic necessity, Kōmei saw humiliation. He became a vocal critic, well, as vocal as an emperor in seclusion could be. Through carefully worded edicts and symbolic gestures, Kōmei aligned himself with a growing faction of court nobles and regional lords who favored imperial restoration and national resistance to foreign influence. His stance was clear: Japan must remain pure, foreigners must leave. The emperor's voice must matter again. In this way, Kōmei became a symbol, not just of divine descent, but of rising political relevance. It was dangerous territory. The final decades of the Edo period were already politically volatile. The shogunate was weakening. Anti-foreign sentiment was growing. Nationalists and traditionalists began to rally around the idea of sono joy, revere the emperor, expel the barbarians. And there, at the center of it, was Kōmei, a cautious but clear advocate for imperial authority, lending legitimacy to what was quickly becoming a revolutionary cause. And then, in January 1867, just as the country teetered on the brink of transition, he died. The official explanation was prompt and precise: smallpox. The emperor had reportedly developed symptoms in mid-January, worsened over the course of a week, and succumbed on January 30th, at the age of 35. It was sudden, unexpected, inconvenient, and for many unbelievable. Whispers of foul play began almost immediately. Some suggested that he had been poisoned by anti-imperial forces within the shogunate, worried that Kōmei's influence was becoming too dangerous. Others speculated that radical pro-imperial elements had silenced him to make way for his more malleable and less politically assertive son, Mutsuhito, the future Emperor Meiji. But like most rumors born in closed courts and turbulent times, no proof was ever found. The smallpox explanation was both plausible and convenient. Outbreaks were common in Kyoto. The imperial family, long isolated in ritual and tradition, had not embraced variolation, let alone the Western practice of vaccination, which had just begun to appear in Japan via Dutch and British intermediaries. Kōmei's death was followed by immediate ceremony, then immediate upheaval. His teenage son was installed with minimal delay. And then, just months later, came the Meiji Restoration, a complete political inversion in which the emperor, long a puppet of spiritual abstraction, became the focal point of a new centralized government. Feudal domains were abolished, the shogunate collapsed, and Japan began its rapid, often brutal sprint into modernization. But none of it happened while Kōmei was alive. His death cleared the way, deliberately or accidentally, for a transformation he might never have endorsed. The man who fought to keep the West out was replaced by a government that invited foreign advisors, adopted Western technology, and restructured the state in ways unthinkable under his reign. His body was entombed in the Kyoto Imperial Mausoleum, his memory largely overshadowed by his son's meteoric legacy. Kōmei became, in historical shorthand, the last old emperor, a symbol of resistance to change, both admired and sidelined. And smallpox once again exited the scene without comment. No confession, no motive, just a virus doing what it always did, ending stories before they reached their next chapter. But the irony deepens when you look back a few generations. Because Kōmei wasn't the first Japanese emperor to be claimed by this same disease. Nearly 2 centuries earlier, in a much quieter time, another sovereign had fallen to smallpox, and in doing so became the first Japanese emperor whose death was attributed to it. A beginning of something that never quite ended. 17th Emperor Higashiyama, Japan, e.us. 1709 to 1710. If ever there were an emperor defined more by stillness than speech, more by ritual than reign, it was Emperor Higashiyama. His name rarely appears in textbooks outside of imperial rosters, and his life, contained within the narrow corridors of Kyoto's cloistered court, was one of practiced invisibility. In the world beyond the palace walls, samurai fought, merchants traded, and the Tokugawa shogunate governed with stern efficiency. But within the paper-thin walls of the imperial residence, Higashiyama lived a life measured in poems, incense, and bows. And yet even in that quiet life, untouched by political storms, smallpox found him. Higashiyama was born in 1675, a prince of the imperial blood at a time when the imperial family held no real political power. By the late 17th century, Japan's emperors were largely ceremonial, and the real governance of the nation lay in the hands of the Tokugawa shogunate, headquartered in Edo, modern-day Tokyo. The emperor remained in Kyoto, bound by tradition, presiding over seasonal festivals and maintaining spiritual continuity while the shogun ran the state. This arrangement, centuries old by Higashiyama's time, meant that emperors were chosen as much for their agreeability as their lineage. Higashiyama was selected to ascend the throne in 1687, but his reign did not officially begin until 1709, following the abdication of his father, Emperor Reigen. This long transition period was customary. Japanese emperors often abdicated and took religious vows, ruling in name for a while before stepping back entirely. It was less a political event and more a change in posture. When Higashiyama finally assumed the chrysanthemum throne, it was less a coronation than a continuation. His court was quiet. His days were filled with poetry readings, religious observance, and the occasional official audience. The shogunate handled foreign affairs, tax policy, military command, and nearly every other function of government. Higashiyama, like most emperors of the Edo period, focused on being imperial, not executive. Still, his reign, brief as it was not entirely uneventful. One of Higashiyama's most lasting influences came not through decree, but through court aesthetics. Under his watch, classical poetry was revived. Buddhist ceremonies regained some of their former elegance. He cultivated an atmosphere of refined restraint, re-emphasizing the imperial family's role as cultural stewards rather than political actors. It was an identity that suited both the court and the country. Japan didn't need its emperor to rule, it needed him to persist. But then, in October 1710, less than 2 years into his official reign, Higashiyama fell ill. The court, as always, was discreet. Illness among the imperial family was considered a delicate subject, not to be discussed openly. But reports began to circulate quietly through Kyoto. The emperor had developed a sudden fever. Then came weakness. Then, unmistakably, the skin eruptions associated with smallpox. This was no minor infection. The strain that struck the court in 1710 appeared to be a severe outbreak, and the emperor's condition deteriorated quickly. By the end of October, courtiers began preparing the palace for mourning rituals. Higashiyama, at the age of just 35, died on October the 16th, his reign ending almost as soon as it had begun. His death shocked the court, but not the country. After all, the emperor's political absence meant that few outside Kyoto would have felt the impact directly. Still, the symbolism was deeply unsettling. Emperors were seen as divine descendants of the sun goddess Amaterasu. The idea that such a being could succumb to smallpox, the most human of afflictions, disrupted the serene order of the universe, if only for a moment. Higashiyama's funeral, like his life, was understated and precise. He was buried in Tsuki no wa no Misasagi, a mausoleum in the Senyuji temple complex, alongside other emperors and nobles. The succession passed smoothly to his son, Emperor Nakamikado, and the machinery of ceremonial monarchy resumed without delay. But smallpox had made its point. It had reached the heart of an empire known for its controlled stillness, its ability to resist foreign influence, disease, and disruption, and it had left behind not a political crisis, but a philosophical one. If even emperors could die from the same invisible threat that stalked peasants and laborers, what exactly separated the sacred from the ordinary? Higashiyama's death marked something else too, a warning. For generations, the imperial court had resisted adopting foreign medical practices, even those from China or Korea. Superstition mingled with religious orthodoxy, and though variolation was known in East Asia by this time, it remained a subject of debate and unease within the Japanese aristocracy. The debate would continue until it couldn't, because Higashiyama was not the last Japanese emperor to fall to smallpox, nor the most symbolically important. That title would go to one of his distant predecessors, a ruler who died when Japan was still learning how to record its own history. A death so early in the imperial chronicle that it would echo across more than a millennium. The emperor, who according to tradition was the first to die of smallpox in Japan, at a time when the disease was still a mystery, and the empire still an idea. 18. Emperor Bidatsu, Japan Arjos, 572 to 585. He ruled in an era that barely knew how to record time, let alone death. Emperor Bidatsu, the 30th sovereign in Japan's imperial line according to tradition, lived in a world straddling myth and early statehood, where emperors were more demigod than bureaucrat, and illnesses were interpreted less as infections than as divine messages. And yet, even in this world of oracles and omens, smallpox still found him. Bidatsu's reign sits at the hazy edge of Japanese antiquity, after the legendary reigns of the first emperors, but before the country had developed a consistent written historical record. Much of what we know about him comes from early chronicles like the Nihon Shoki and the Kojiki, both compiled centuries later and blending history, genealogy, and spiritual narrative in a single breath. These records are not biographies. They're more like ritualized memory, shaped to support imperial continuity rather than clinical truth. But within their highly stylized lines, one fact emerges with surprising clarity. Bidatsu died of a strange disease marked by disfiguring pustules. The chroniclers didn't call it smallpox, of course, the word didn't exist yet, but they described his symptoms in a way that left little doubt for modern scholars. A spreading rash, a fever, and a progressive decline. Bidatsu was, almost certainly, the first Japanese emperor to die of smallpox. And that simple, devastating fact marks a significant moment in Japanese history, not just for what it says about one man's death, but for what it reveals about the arrival of something new, something foreign, something terrifying, infectious disease as empire. Born in 538 CE, Bidatsu was the second son of Emperor Kōmei and ascended the throne in 572. His reign came during a time of cultural and political transformation. The Japanese state was still in formation, caught in the process of centralization, religious conflict, and contact with continental Asia, especially the Korean kingdoms of Baekje and Silla, which brought with them new technologies, philosophies, and religions. Chief among these was Buddhism. Bidatsu's reign was deeply marked by the arrival and early spread of Buddhism in Japan. Though he personally remained aligned with traditional Shinto beliefs, his court became a battleground between pro-Buddhist factions, led by the powerful Soga clan, and Shinto traditionalists, led by the Mononobe and Nakatomi clans. This wasn't just a religious debate, it was a proxy war for political control. Buddhism came with foreign alliances, new rituals, and, critically, its own way of interpreting illness and death. So when Bidatsu fell ill with a disease that caused fever and visible lesions, the reactions were more theological than medical. Some saw it as a divine punishment for tolerating Buddhist idols in court. Others interpreted it as a curse from ancestral gods angered by foreign influence. Still others saw it as a test, a heavenly trial meant to measure the spiritual strength of the emperor and his regime. But the disease didn't care about interpretation. Bidatsu's condition reportedly worsened in waves. His skin developed unusual markings. He became weak. His court grew silent. The chroniclers, likely unsure how to describe what they were seeing, leaned into metaphors. They spoke of heaven's disfavor and spirits made visible on the flesh. But beneath the stylized language, one sees the contours of smallpox, a disease which may have entered Japan through trade or diplomatic missions from the Korean peninsula or China. And if it was smallpox, then it represents one of the earliest documented appearances of the disease in Japanese history, a moment when the divine body of the emperor was shown to be vulnerable, not to a rebellion or divine retribution, but to something microscopic, something invisible, something new. Bidatsu died in 585 after 13 years on the throne. His death didn't trigger a crisis. Succession passed relatively smoothly to his half-brother, Emperor Kōmei, but it did leave behind a lingering sense of instability. If the emperor could suffer such a fate, what did that mean for the nation's divine protection, for its cultural identity, for the newly forming court that was trying to pull Japan together under centralized rule? In retrospect, Bidatsu's death signaled more than the loss of one monarch. It marked the beginning of a pattern that would stretch through every century of imperial history, the collision of sacred authority with secular mortality. He was not the last emperor to die of smallpox, nor the most famous, but he was the first, and perhaps the most symbolically fragile. His passing introduced the idea that Japan, despite its myths, its isolation, its rituals, was part of the same biological map as the rest of the world. A place where disease could arrive unannounced, where divine lineage was no shield, and where even the gods, if they walked among men, could not guarantee immunity. But if smallpox had crossed the sea into Japan, it had also begun traveling another far deadlier path through entire continents, aboard ships not of pilgrims or diplomats, but of conquest. And in the Andean highlands of South America, it found a new target. An emperor whose realm had never known the disease before, and whose death would leave an empire in freefall. 19. Huayna Capac, Sapa Inca RC 1493 to 1525. He was the last Inca emperor to rule over an undivided empire. Huayna Capac, sovereign of Tawantinsuyu, the land of the Four Quarters. His reign marked the height of Inca power, a sprawling network of mountains, rivers and roadways stretching across modern-day Peru, Ecuador, Bolivia, Chile and Argentina. At its peak, the empire encompassed over 10 million subjects, and a logistical apparatus so advanced it impressed even the Europeans, who would soon dismantle it. But Huayna Capac never met a Spaniard, never saw a cross, never heard the word conquistador. His killer arrived years before they did, and it didn't carry a sword. It came in silence, unseen, unrecognized, and unstoppable. A foreign agent with no political ambitions, no religion, no strategy, just replication, just contagion, just time. Modern historians agree Huayna Capac likely died of smallpox around 1525, years before Francisco Pizarro set foot in Peru. At the time, the Inca had no name for the disease, no cure, no memory of it. The idea that someone could fall ill, erupt in blisters, and die within days was alien to their medical and spiritual worldview. The Spanish, however, knew it well, and they carried it, unknowingly, efficiently, across oceans. The theory goes like this. Smallpox first entered the Americas via the Caribbean in the early 1500s, brought by European sailors, settlers, and enslaved people. From there, it spread southward, leaping across trade routes and indigenous networks faster than any conquistador could travel. By the time it reached the Andes, it had already decimated coastal populations and destabilized regional alliances. The Inca Empire was next. At first, no one knew what to call it. Huayna Capac had been leading military campaigns in the north, extending Inca control into what is now Ecuador. It was during this northern expedition, far from Cusco, that he fell ill. Eyewitnesses later described a sudden fever, weakness, and visible eruptions on his skin. His attendants, having never encountered smallpox, likely believed it to be a spiritual or supernatural affliction. Rituals were performed, offerings made, but nothing stopped the progression. He died in or around Tumabamba, a city he had been developing as a potential administrative capital, and his death, mysterious and unexpected, plunged the empire into chaos. Huayna Capac had not clearly named a successor. Two of his sons, Huascar, based in Cusco, and Atahualpa, stationed in the north, both had plausible claims to the throne. Their mothers came from different regional factions, and their power bases were geographically distant. The result, a civil war that would tear the Inca Empire apart just as European ships appeared on the Pacific horizon. It's one of history's bleakest ironies. The disease didn't just kill the emperor, it fractured the empire. The succession crisis it triggered made the Inca far more vulnerable to external conquest than they otherwise would have been. When Pizarro arrived in 1532, he walked into a landscape already ravaged by plague, grief, and internal division. Smallpox had cleared the path long before muskets and horses arrived, and yet the tragedy of Huayna Capac's death lies not only in what followed, but in what preceded it. By all accounts, his reign had been marked by innovation, infrastructure, and expansion. He had continued the work of his father, Tupac Inca Yupanqui, who had doubled the empire's size. Huayna Capac solidified roads, expanded the administrative class, and developed the Inca's famous quipu system of knotted record-keeping. He was not a passive ruler, he was a builder, a unifier, a systematizer. And then, suddenly, he was gone. No war, no assassination, just a disease that bypassed fortresses and diplomacy alike. His mummified remains, like those of other Inca emperors, were reportedly carried back to Cusco and enshrined in a temple. The Inca did not view death as an ending, but as a transformation. Their rulers became sacred ancestors, eternal presences who continued to guide the empire. But even sacred memory could not hold the line against microbial invasion. Smallpox didn't just kill Huayna Capac, it rewrote history. Without his death, there may have been no civil war. Without the civil war, no weakened army. Without the weakened army, no quick victory for Pizarro. The fall of the Inca was not simply a clash of swords. It was a sequence of vulnerabilities, initiated by a death no one understood and no one saw coming. And the disease didn't stop with him, because just months later, as war erupted between his sons, the same invisible scourge travelled further south, slipping through temples and markets, jumping from porters to priests. And in the heart of the empire's resistance, a new leader rose to power. Briefly, definitely, but not even defiance could keep the disease at bay. 20. Cuitláhuac, Huayna of the Aztec, R 1520. His reign lasted just 80 days. A ruler forged in the crucible of resistance, Cuitláhuac was never meant to inherit the throne under such circumstances. He was not the eldest, nor the most visible, nor the most diplomatic. But when the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan erupted in fire and foreign incursion, and the once mighty Montezuma lay dead under a cloud of betrayal, it was Cuitláhuac who rose to lead. His time in power was brief, but not forgotten, because in those 80 days he did what few others dared. He beat the Spanish, and then, not long after, he died, not by musket, not by blade, not by execution, but by something far older, far less visible, and infinitely more insidious: smallpox. In the summer of 1520, Tenochtitlan was a city on the brink. Spanish forces under Hernán Cortés had arrived a year earlier, and through a careful blend of diplomacy, manipulation, and hostage-taking, had managed to place themselves at the heart of the Aztec Empire. Montezuma II, Cuitláhuac's half-brother, had tried to contain the crisis through appeasement, but his efforts only delayed the inevitable. Cuitláhuac, meanwhile, had been watching, listening, waiting. He had served as Tlacotalcatl, a high-ranking military commander responsible for the city's arsenal. His role was not ceremonial. He was a strategist, a warrior, and most importantly, a skeptic of Spanish intentions. Unlike Montezuma, who viewed the newcomers through the lens of prophecy and divine ambiguity, Cuitláhuac saw them for what they were: invaders. In late June 1520, during a series of violent confrontations now known as the La Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows, the people of Tenochtitlan turned against their unwanted guests. After Montezuma's mysterious death, whether by Spanish hands, by his own people, or by accident remains unclear, Cuitláhuac took command of the defense, and under his leadership the Aztecs forced the Spanish out of the city, dealing them one of their greatest defeats in the New World. The victory was astonishing. For a moment it looked as though the tide had turned. Cortés's forces were routed. Hundreds of Spanish soldiers were killed or drowned in the lake as they fled. Aztec morale surged. Tenochtitlan stood strong. Then the disease arrived. It had come aboard a Spanish ship months earlier, likely carried by an African or European crew member infected during the voyage. The virus required no strategy, no alliances, no weapons. It travelled by air, by skin, by breath. And in a city as dense and vibrant as Tenochtitlan, surrounded by canals, bustling markets, and tight family compounds, it spread with terrifying speed. Smallpox had never existed in the Americas before 1492. There was no immunity, no tradition of treatment, no cultural memory to fall back on. The Aztecs interpreted it through a mix of religious frameworks. Some saw it as punishment, others as sorcery, others still as a harbinger of apocalyptic change. For Cuitláhuac, it was more than symbolic, it was lethal. Just weeks after his victory over the Spanish, he began showing signs of illness. The sources are sparse and filtered through the European lens, but Nahuatl accounts preserved in later codices suggest he developed a terrible sickness that caused the skin to erupt, which spread rapidly throughout his body. His strength faltered, he retreated from public life, and in October 1520, not even 3 months into his reign, he died. He was around 41 years old. The death of Cuitláhuac was not just the end of a ruler, it was the shattering of a brief window of possibility. In a different timeline, his leadership might have stabilized the empire. He might have united the resistance, fortified the capital, and brokered new alliances with neighboring city-states. But his death plunged Tenochtitlan into another succession crisis at the very moment it needed coherence most. His successor, Cuauhtémoc, would inherit a city in disarray, its military weakened, its people dying by the thousands, and its religious foundations crumbling under the weight of disease. By some accounts, smallpox killed up to half the population of Tenochtitlan within a few months. Corpses filled the streets, temples were silent, priests performed rituals over empty courtyards. The psychological impact was enormous. How could the gods allow this? How could an empire fall, not in battle, but in bed? Cuitláhuac became a symbol, not of failure, but of lost potential. The last Aztec ruler to strike a decisive blow against the Spanish, the only one to rule between Montezuma and the fall of Tenochtitlan, and a man who fought for a city that was already invisibly being undone from the inside out. He died too soon to be conquered, but not soon enough to stop what came next. Because across the ocean, in another island kingdom shaped by isolation and volcanic splendor, a very different kind of ruler was preparing to cross the sea, not to conquer, but to meet the conquerors. And unknowingly, to bring a nation into contact with a virus it had never met. 21st Kamehameha II, King of Hawaii, ye 1819 to 1824, he died far from home. Kamehameha II, born Liholiho, was not just a Hawaiian king. He was the bearer of a legacy carved out by his father, the legendary Kamehameha I, who had unified the Hawaiian Islands by war, diplomacy, and sheer force of presence. Liholiho inherited that empire, but not his father's certainty. His reign was marked by disruption, reinvention, and one of the most defining encounters in Hawaiian history. The moment the kingdom met the full force of Western disease, it began, fittingly, with a voyage. By 1823, Kamehameha II had decided to do what no Hawaiian monarch had done before: visit Great Britain, the seat of empire, trade, and growing diplomatic influence in the Pacific. European ships had been circling Hawaiian shores for decades, but this was the first time a Hawaiian sovereign would step into the very heart of colonial power, not as a subject, but as a peer. He brought with him a modest entourage, including his queen and half-sister, Queen Kamamalu, as well as high-ranking chiefs, translators, and advisors. Their goal was to negotiate formal recognition of the Hawaiian kingdom's sovereignty, establish trade relations, and return with the prestige of international diplomacy. The mission was ambitious, symbolic, and in hindsight, tragically doomed, because the delegation wasn't just crossing oceans, they were crossing immunological boundaries their bodies had never prepared for. The voyage itself was uneventful. They arrived in London in May 1824 and were initially welcomed with curiosity and admiration. The Hawaiian royals were dressed in Western-style formal wear, silk, lace, top hats, and accompanied by Protestant missionaries who helped craft a politically palatable image for their hosts. The newspapers wrote about them with a mix of fascination and exoticism. Artists scrambled to paint portraits. Crowds gathered to glimpse the royal visitors. They were slated to meet King George IV, who, in typical fashion, delayed the meeting indefinitely. And then the symptoms began. By early June, both Kamehameha II and Queen Kamamalu developed fevers, coughs, and fatigue. Within days, it was clear they had contracted measles. To the British, this was a mild childhood disease. To the Hawaiian royals, born and raised in an isolated Pacific environment where such pathogens had never circulated, it was an unmitigated disaster. Measles in virgin soil populations, as modern historians call them, behaves differently. Without centuries of immunity and genetic resistance, the virus spreads fast, burns hot, and often kills. Missionary journals describe the king and queen's health deteriorating rapidly. Their skin broke out in rashes, their strength vanished. The British doctors, unsure how to help, administered basic care, but it wasn't enough. Queen Kamamalu died on July 8, 1824. Kamehameha II followed 6 days later on July 14th at the age of 27. Neither lived to meet the King of England. The double royal death sent shockwaves through both British and Hawaiian circles. The grandeur of the diplomatic mission, the hope of building a bridge between empires, had collapsed into tragedy. Their bodies, now symbols of cultural vulnerability, lay in Caledonian hotel rooms repurposed as death chambers. The British press, previously amused by their visit, shifted tone. The Hawaiian court, thousands of miles away, received the news with stunned grief, but it was more than personal loss. It was an epidemiological moment, a case study in what happens when global contact exceeds biological preparedness. Western diseases had been devastating Hawaiian populations since the late 18th century, when the first European ships brought not just trade, but influenza, venereal infections, tuberculosis, and beyond. Measles, however, had not yet made its way to the islands. Kamehameha II and Kamamalu may well have been the first Hawaiians to contract it. They would not be the last. Their bodies were returned to Hawaii in 1825 aboard the Blonde, a British warship dispatched with military honours and ceremonial care. Their coffins were received with chants and mourning at Honolulu Harbour, and they were interred at the Royal Mausoleum at Iolani Palace, buried not just as royals, but as martyrs of cultural collision. Kamehameha II's reign had already been one of upheaval. Upon ascending the throne in 1819, he had abolished the kapu system, the traditional religious and legal code that governed nearly every aspect of Hawaiian life. It was a bold, disruptive move, done in part to embrace modern governance and in part to accommodate growing missionary influence. Some saw him as progressive, others as a symbol of cultural compromise. But whatever one thinks of his rule, his death crystallized the stakes of contact. It wasn't war or colonization that brought him down. It was something no sword could parry and no alliance could delay. And the damage wasn't done, because in that same London hotel, another royal lay dying, Kamehameha's queen, Kamamalu. And her death, coming just days before his, marked not only the end of a dynasty's hope for European recognition, but the beginning of a devastating epidemic back home. An epidemic that would echo for generations. 22nd, Queen Kamamalu of Hawaii, consort D. 1824. She arrived in London wrapped in velvet and ceremony, her regal bearing marked by the strange beauty of two worlds colliding. Queen Kamamalu, senior wife and half-sister to Kamehameha II, was tall, poised and striking, frequently described by British observers as both imposing and gracious, though always with the condescending awe reserved for royals from the so-called fringes of empire. She was no stranger to protocol, no stranger to visibility. In Hawaii, her presence at court was both ceremonial and symbolic, but in London, she became something else entirely, an emblem of cultural crossing, and then, very suddenly, a casualty of it. Like her husband, Kamamalu had come to England with diplomatic ambition. The journey was historic, the first voyage of a Hawaiian sovereign and queen to a European capital. They travelled aboard the Lobengula, a British warship, across half the world and into the heart of empire. Their goal was recognition of the Hawaiian kingdom's sovereignty, something no Pacific nation had yet secured from any European power. But more than that, they came to be seen, and they were. In the spring of 1824, London received the Hawaiian royals with curiosity, pomp, and a subtle undercurrent of amusement. Newspapers described them as exotic but dignified. Artists sketched their portraits, not always faithfully. Queen Kamamalu stood out, not just for her stature, she was over 6 feet tall, but for her style, elaborate feather cloaks, European court gowns worn with Polynesian grace, and a solemn confidence that defied novelty. She was no mere accessory to her husband's mission. She was the senior wife of a sovereign dynasty, descended from high-ranking alii nobility, whose genealogy ran deeper than most European lines could dream of. But beneath the silken spectacle, the environment was biologically treacherous. Kamamalu, like her husband, had no immunity to the viruses circulating through the crowded, soot-stained streets of early 19th century London. Hawaiians, isolated for centuries, had only begun encountering old-world diseases a few decades earlier, and measles had not yet reached the islands. The Queen and King had never been exposed. They had no antibodies, no resistance, and no way to comprehend the danger posed by a handshake or an enclosed room. Sometime in early June 1824, during their extended wait to meet King George IV, Kamamalu began to feel ill. At first it seemed minor, a cough, fatigue, a bit of fever, but within days the symptoms worsened. Fever spiked, a rash appeared, physicians were summoned. The Queen's condition deteriorated rapidly, and the diagnosis, measles, was finally confirmed. But by then, there was little anyone could do. She was not alone in her suffering. Kamehameha II, her husband, was falling ill at the same time, possibly infected during the same exposure. The rooms at the Caledonian Hotel, where the royal party was staying, turned from diplomatic staging ground into quarantine ward. British physicians did what they could with the medicine of the day, bleeding, rest, herbal tinctures, but it was no match for the force of a pathogen encountering a new population. On July 8, 1824, Queen Kamamalu died, surrounded not by family or subjects, but by a few British officials and the remnants of her travel party. She was 22 years old. Her husband would follow her 6 days later. Their deaths shocked British society. The press, which had previously romanticized and exoticized the Hawaiian monarchs, now wrote in reverent tones. The tragedy was palpable. 2 sovereigns, young and charismatic, struck down in the heart of empire by a disease that, in Britain, was considered mostly a childhood nuisance. But for the Hawaiians, it was more than a tragedy. It was a national reckoning. News of the Queen's death reached Hawaii in late 1824, triggering public mourning and religious ceremony. Kamamalu was beloved, dignified, generous, and known for her patronage of both traditional arts and the emerging hybrid court culture that blended Hawaiian and Western elements. Her loss was more than symbolic. It marked the first time a member of the Hawaiian alii class had died from a foreign disease while abroad, and it foreshadowed what was coming next. Because Kamamalu and Kamehameha II had not just been infected abroad, they had become vectors. When their bodies were returned to Honolulu in 1825 aboard the British frigate Blonde, the virus came too. Measles arrived in the islands with their coffins. The resulting outbreak tore through a population that had no defenses. Thousands died within months. Families were wiped out. Whole villages were affected. The alii, whose genealogies were carefully preserved and protected, saw their ranks thinned. The population, already in decline from earlier waves of disease, fell even faster. Kamamalu's death marked the turning point in Hawaii's epidemiological history, the moment when disease became not a distant threat but a permanent feature of the kingdom. Her legacy remains mostly overshadowed by that of her husband and by the grander arcs of Hawaiian history that came later, the missionary era, the constitutional monarchy, the eventual overthrow. But her life and death sit at the pivot between sovereignty and vulnerability, between royal glamour and biological fragility. She crossed an ocean to claim dignity on behalf of her people, and instead she found a door to something far older than empire, something no crown could negotiate with. But disease didn't stop with islands, because not long after, across the jungles of Southeast Asia, a different king, guided by science, not conquest, would trace the stars, only to be undone by the mosquitoes beneath them. 23. Mongkut, Rama IV of Siam, Thailand, RR 1851 to 1868. He is remembered in the West as the King from The King and I, a theatrical adaptation of questionable accuracy and considerable distortion. But in his own kingdom, King Mongkut of Siam, also known as Rama IV, was no musical caricature. He was a scholar king, a monk-turned-monarch, and a ruler who faced the gathering storm of colonialism with something rare in the 19th century: scientific foresight. He spoke Latin, studied astronomy, and read European diplomatic manuals while dressed in monastic robes. He modernized his kingdom not with fire and steel, but with treaties and telescopes. And in the end, what killed him wasn't rebellion, assassination, or some geopolitical clash with the British Empire. It was malaria, caught while trying to observe a solar eclipse. It's hard to imagine a more ironic death for a monarch known as the father of Thai science. Mongkut, born in 1804, had spent 27 years in a Buddhist monastery before ascending the throne at the age of 47. During those decades of religious life, he developed a deep interest in astronomy, mathematics, and languages, teaching himself Pali, Sanskrit, Latin, and English, often from missionary texts and Western scientific literature. By the time he became king in 1851, he had already decided that Siam's survival depended not on resisting the West with swords, but on understanding it better than the West understood Siam. While other kingdoms in the region fell to colonial occupation, Mongkut pursued a middle path, signing treaties, opening limited ports, and reforming internal institutions to satisfy European pressure without surrendering sovereignty. His policies were not universally admired at home. Many traditionalists saw his openness to Western science and diplomacy as dangerous. But Mongkut held firm, confident that adaptation was a better defense than isolation. And in 1868, that philosophy took him to the edge of the Thai jungle. A total solar eclipse was predicted for August of that year, visible across parts of southern Siam. Mongkut, now 64, was not content to simply hear about it. He wanted to observe it himself, not as a monarch peering through ceremonial lenses, but as an amateur astronomer, notebook in hand, calculations verified, coordinates precise. He chose a site near Waikor village, in what is now Prachuap Khiri Khan province. He led an expedition of courtiers, scientists, and foreign observers to witness the eclipse, which he had calculated independently and with astonishing accuracy, reportedly beating even some Western predictions in precision. The eclipse was a success, the observation a triumph, the aftermath a tragedy. Shortly after returning to Bangkok, Mongkut and several members of his party began showing signs of illness, fever, chills, fatigue. It didn't take long to identify the cause. The king had been bitten by a mosquito carrying malaria, and the infection, likely Plasmodium falciparum, progressed rapidly. Mongkut's health declined over several weeks. He was reportedly aware of the severity of his condition and used his remaining time to secure the succession of his son, Chulalongkorn, who would later become one of the most transformative rulers in Thai history. On October 1st, 1868, Mongkut died just 6 weeks after witnessing the eclipse that had brought him such pride. His death was more than personal loss. It marked the end of a uniquely intellectual reign, one that had successfully kept Siam independent at a time when nearly every other kingdom in the region had fallen under European control. Mongkut had walked a narrow path between tradition and innovation, faith and science, and his demise served as a poetic, if devastating, reminder that knowledge, no matter how vast, does not grant immunity. But Mongkut's legacy endured. His son, Chulalongkorn, would go on to complete many of his father's reforms, abolishing slavery, modernizing the bureaucracy, and further protecting Siam's independence. The line held, the empire endured. Still, it's hard not to be struck by the quiet irony of Mongkut's death. A king who had mastered the stars, felled by what floated in the air around him. A man who calculated celestial motion to the second, yet couldn't calculate what might be buzzing at his ankle in a shadowed forest. And across the continent, in a vastly different empire, another king faced a death that was far less poetic, but equally mysterious. His illness unfolded on a journey while fleeing from colonial forces as the world around him shifted and fell. And when he died, the question still lingered. What exactly killed him? 24. Lobengula, king of the Ndebele Matabele, d. 1894. His kingdom was carved from resistance. Lobengula, the last king of the Ndebele, often referred to as the Matabele, inherited more than a throne. He inherited a fragile buffer between African autonomy and the oncoming machinery of British imperialism. Son of Mzilikazi, a Zulu general turned founder of the Ndebele nation, Lobengula was a monarch caught in a narrowing corridor. Every treaty he signed brought the British closer. Every delay bought time, but at a cost. And when he died, somewhere in the wilds of southern Africa, fleeing British troops in the final days of the First Matabele War, his death became not just the end of a reign, but the beginning of a myth. The cause of that death? Probably smallpox, possibly something else, possibly both. The truth, like Lobengula himself, disappeared into the bush. He ruled from Bulawayo, a city of palisades, cattle and stone. His court was imposing and hierarchical, governed by strict codes and a powerful warrior class. The Ndebele maintained a well-trained army, modelled on Zulu traditions, and for years they resisted both Portuguese incursions and Boer expansion. But the British South Africa Company, under Cecil Rhodes, brought a new kind of threat, diplomacy disguised as business. In 1888, Lobengula signed the now infamous Rudd Concession, a document he believed granted limited mineral rights to a small group of British representatives. In practice, it opened the door for wholesale colonization. Within 2 years, British settlers and soldiers were flooding into what would later become southern Rhodesia. Lobengula, betrayed and surrounded, tried to resist, but the tide had already turned. The First Matabele War broke out in 1893. Outnumbered and outgunned, the Ndebele fought fiercely. Lobengula himself ordered a scorched earth strategy, retreating northward into the hinterlands while sending messengers to sue for peace. British columns advanced, skirmishes erupted, villages were razed, and then he vanished. Lobengula fled with a small group of loyal followers into the Matobo Hills, deep in what is now Zimbabwe. For months, nothing was heard. British commanders debated whether he was dead, captured, or regrouping. Finally, word came through Ndebele sources. The king had died, but the details were murky. Some said he succumbed to smallpox, already sweeping through the region. Others whispered of poisoning, either self-inflicted or at the hands of his own men to prevent his capture. Some suggested he died from exhaustion or heartbreak or humiliation. His body was never found. No grave was confirmed. His death, like his resistance, became a legend. What is certain is that smallpox was raging through the region at the time. The British recorded numerous cases among their own troops, and African populations, unprotected by vaccination, suffered staggering losses. Lobengula, weakened by stress, constant movement, and lack of medical care, would have been highly vulnerable. His death marked the end of Ndebele sovereignty. Within months, the kingdom collapsed. British colonial rule took hold, and the narrative quickly shifted. Lobengula became a cautionary tale in colonial dispatches. A king who signed the wrong treaty, trusted the wrong men, and paid the ultimate price. But to his people, he remained something else, a symbol of quiet resistance, a ghost who had eluded both capture and explanation, a king who died not for losing a war, but for trying to avoid one. And yet, in the grand tradition of royal exits, his story is incomplete, because what do you call it when the most important figure in your political universe vanishes, and all you're left with is second-hand reports of disease and whispers from the bush? You call it history. And elsewhere in a distant kingdom by the lakes of Central Africa, another monarch would face his own mysterious end, not in war, but in wasting illness that left no clear diagnosis, only speculation and shadows. 25. Mutesa I, Kabaka of Buganda, R. 1856 to 1884. He ruled from the hilltops of Buganda, a kingdom nestled along the northern shores of Lake Victoria, with royal drums echoing through banana groves and red earth. Mutesa I, Kabaka of Buganda, was no passive monarch. He played the European colonial powers like chess pieces, wrote letters to Queen Victoria, received missionaries, and declared allegiance only when it suited him. He was sharp, unpredictable, and politically agile, a master of ceremonial hospitality and realpolitik. But in the end, what brought him down wasn't betrayal or invasion. It was a disease that blurred the line between mystery and medicine, and whose true name is still debated. When Mutesa died in 1884, his kingdom was already caught in the early stirrings of colonial interference. Yet his death wasn't the result of foreign gunfire. It came slowly from within. Historical records from both Ugandan oral traditions and missionary accounts describe a lingering illness. Some called it a wasting sickness. Others reported chronic inflammation, fevers, or yellowing of the eyes. In hindsight, modern scholars have offered several possibilities. Hepatitis, possibly from contaminated food or water, seems likely, but the truth remains elusive. At the time, the Buganda court was both secretive and deeply spiritual. Illness in a monarch wasn't viewed purely as a medical issue, it was a matter of cosmology, of divine favor or ancestral disapproval. Disease, especially lingering disease, often signified imbalance, not just in the body, but in the kingdom itself. So when Mutesa began to weaken, palace advisors oscillated between summoning medicine men, receiving foreign doctors, and attempting to preserve royal dignity with carefully worded pronouncements. Complicating the picture was the arrival of Christian missionaries, both Protestant and Catholic, as well as Muslim emissaries from Egypt. Mutesa had initially welcomed them all, leveraging their influence to his advantage. He even reportedly converted strategically to Islam for a time, then flirted with Christian baptism. His court became a battleground of religious persuasion, with factions vying for royal favor. But as his health declined, so did the unity of his court. The illness rendered him vulnerable, not just physically, but politically. Whispers of succession began circulating. Factions hardened, foreign influence deepened. Mutesa died in 1884, reportedly in Kasubi, the traditional burial site of Buganda kings. His body was interred in a grand tomb, now a UNESCO World Heritage Site. But the vacuum left behind was immediate and volatile. His son, Mwanga II, would ascend the throne, but without Mutesa's diplomatic finesse. Within just a few years, Buganda would be engulfed by missionary wars, internal executions, and colonial manipulation. Mwanga's rule would be defined by crisis, not control. And so, Mutesa's death marked the beginning of the end of a self-determined Buganda. His mysterious illness was never formally diagnosed. It could have been hepatitis, it could have been liver cancer, it could have been something now lost in translation between traditional understanding and Western medical terminology. But what it signaled was clear: a shift, a transition from the age of African agency to the century of European maps and protectorate agreements. Mutesa had played the game well, flirting with Islam, entertaining Christianity, smiling at colonial officials while keeping them at arm's length. But illness, in the end, cannot be negotiated, and neither could the legacy of what came next. Because in another great empire, older, richer, and more accustomed to absolute power, a sultan would die under similarly ambiguous circumstances. His affliction wasn't just physical, it was described as divine punishment. His enemies whispered of sin, his supporters of poison, but under it all lay the burning truth of another body failing and another throne preparing for silence. 26. Selim I Yavuz, Ottoman Sultan BE 1512 to 1520. They called him Yavuz, the Grim, not because he was cruel, though he certainly was, but because he was unyielding. A warrior sultan of the early Ottoman Empire, Selim I reigned for only 8 years, but reshaped the Islamic world in a way few rulers ever had. He conquered Syria, Egypt, and the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. He doubled the size of the empire, and when he died suddenly in 1520, the cause of death was cloaked in contradictions. The official story: a malignant boil, a phrase that might make modern readers wince but said little to contemporaries beyond the fact that something rotted from within. Modern historians have offered a variety of possibilities. Some say anthrax contracted through infected animals or contaminated fabric. Others suggest skin cancer or an aggressive abscess that turned septic. Ottoman records, ever poetic, describe a lesion that resisted treatment, worsened rapidly, and eventually left him unable to govern. Whatever it was visible, painful, and politically destabilizing. But Selim's death didn't come at a random time. It arrived at a moment of paranoid transition. He had seized power in 1512 by deposing his father, Bayezid II, and defeating his brothers in battle. He centralized authority and built up military strength to unprecedented levels. His campaigns against the Mamluks weren't just territorial, they were spiritual, legitimized by the claim that the Ottoman Sultan was now Caliph of the Islamic world. It was a bold rebranding of empire, not just ruler of lands, but protector of the faithful. Selim wielded this mantle with fire, but his personal health was another story. Accounts describe him withdrawing from public appearances near the end of his life, delegating more responsibilities to his son, Suleiman, who would later become known as the Magnificent. Selim's entourage of physicians and court officials gave conflicting updates. Some spoke of a simple infection, others of divine punishment. As always in court life, truth and narrative diverged. And then, in September 1520, he died, abruptly, without war, without fanfare, and, crucially, without explanation the court could agree upon. What makes Selim's case notable is the contrast. Here was a man who had brought entire civilizations under his rule, who had stormed into Cairo and proclaimed himself caliph, who had refashioned the Ottoman Empire into a religiously unified powerhouse, and yet died not by rebellion or assassination, but by something small, slow, and secret. His death was a medical mystery and a political handoff. Suleiman inherited not just the throne, but the shadow of an unresolved exit, and in that shadow he would build a golden age. But Selim's demise remains the final punctuation mark in a brutal, ambitious reign. He began as a conqueror, he ended as a patient, and in the west of Europe, not long after Selim's death, another monarch would begin a very different decline, this one not of body but of mind. A king who saw enemies in shadows, heard voices in the court, and laughed in the middle of wars. A monarch so maddened that his entire kingdom wondered Is the throne haunted, or is the king simply lost inside himself? 27. Charles VI of France. The Mad reigned 1380 to 1422. It didn't start all at once. It never does. At first, Charles VI simply seemed distracted, a little tired, a touch irritable. Courtiers whispered of episodes, brief lapses in decorum, strange silences during meetings, or sudden fits of anger, followed by long spells of regret. But he was young, after all, only 12 when he inherited the crown, and not yet 20 when the real business of ruling began. France could wait. France always waited, but by the time Charles was 30, the whispers had turned into rumours, and the rumours into rituals of avoidance, because their king had lost himself. For over 4 decades, Charles VI would reign over a France riven by internal division, foreign invasion, and the quiet collapse of royal coherence. He was not the first monarch to struggle with illness, but he was one of the few whose illness became a national metaphor, a cracked mirror held up to a kingdom that no longer recognized its own reflection. Today, many scholars believe Charles suffered from a psychiatric condition, possibly bipolar disorder with psychotic features or schizoaffective disorder. But in the 14th and 15th centuries, there were no such terms. There was only madness. The episodes became harder to explain. Charles would lose his temper without warning. On one infamous occasion, killing 4 of his own knights, convinced they were plotting his death. In other spells, he would fall into prolonged silence, unable to recognize even his wife or children. Sometimes he believed he was made of glass and would shatter if touched. Other times he believed he was not the king at all, but someone else, or no one, or dead already. There were stretches when he recovered, months, even years, when he seemed lucid, active, capable of judgment. But the episodes always returned, and the court, ever fearful, learned to walk on tiptoe around the king's mind. France, meanwhile, was falling apart. The 100 Years' War with England raged on, and Charles's inability to govern forced a power vacuum filled by factions. The Armagnacs and the Burgundians, 2 noble coalitions who claimed the right to rule in the king's name. The country split into rival camps, and civil war broke out even as the English pressed in from the north. The Queen, Isabeau of Bavaria, tried to hold the court together, but she was distrusted, accused of manipulation, and eventually shut out of major decisions. Charles's brother, uncles, and cousins all vied for power. Meanwhile, the king sat in the halls of the Hôtel Saint-Paul in Paris, reading the same lines over and over, forgetting names and occasionally screaming at walls. The French people, increasingly familiar with plague, famine, and war, could only add one more affliction to the list: a monarch who no longer believed he was real. Charles died in 1422, physically intact but mentally absent. By then, the English had claimed half of France. His son, Charles VII, inherited a country teetering on the edge, its capital under occupation, its crown contested. But the legacy of Charles VI was not just political collapse. It was a question, the same one muttered in castle halls and scribbled in the margins of chronicles. If the king believes he is made of glass, does the kingdom become glass too? And if so, how many cracks can it take before it finally breaks? That question would echo for generations, long after the wars had ended, because kings are not supposed to vanish inside themselves. They are supposed to stand firm, even if the walls are falling, but sometimes the walls fall inward. And centuries later, in another imperial court far from Paris, another ruler would face a fate not of the mind, but of mysterious physical disintegration. A man so revered, so iconic, that his sudden decline would puzzle physicians and historians for millennia. A boy king, entombed in gold, whose death would raise more questions than his life ever could.